Welcome, you've arrived not at a place, but into a rhythm, into a slower time, one that flows like silt-laden water through forgotten riverbeds. Tonight, there is nothing to hurry for, nothing that must be solved, or rushed, or endured. The walls around you do not need to be guarded. The winds beyond the window carry no urgency. The air is thick with stillness, and that stillness is a gift. So lie back, let your body feel the weight of this moment, and allow the surface tension of the day to break gently apart. Like sediment disturbed by the slow draw of the current, imagine the sound of the night not loud, not silent, but full of the soft textures of sleep, the creak of wooden beams, the rustle of linen as your shoulders fall gently into rest, the distant chirp of a cricket outside some forgotten window, and maybe the slow turning of the world as it exhales beneath you. Your breath becomes slower now. You may feel your heartbeat ease its pace, as if it understands that this is no time for running, no time for reaction. This is a return, a drifting back. Tonight, we do not chase meaning, we let it emerge quietly, patiently, as history does when it is left undisturbed. You are about to journey to a time that no longer exists in the waking world. A time so far behind us that it hums in a different frequency, lower, warmer, and constant. We are going to Babylon, not the Babylon of legend just yet, not the hanging gardens or the towering ziggurats painted in crushed lapis blue. Not the thrones of emperors or the chants of triumphant priests. No, those can wait, because the true Babylon, the lived Babylon, begins not in the palace but in the alleyway, not in the epic but in the ordinary, not in the history books but in the backs of those who bent under the sun to build a city that never asked for their names to be remembered. Before we can witness empires rise or marvels collapse, we must first understand what it was to simply survive, what it was to wake in the heat, to eat the same stale bread, to drink bitter beer not for pleasure but for hydration, what it meant to write with aching hands on clay tablets that might never be read, what it meant to be ruled by gods who never spoke to you, only to those who lived in stone temples behind walls you'd never touch. The Babylon you will visit tonight is not glorious, and that is why it matters. It is dry and dusty, and it smells faintly of fire and clay. The people are tired, their stories are unremarkable, their homes are dark, but they lived, and that living has something to teach us. We sleep soundly now because others once didn't, because they walked barefoot on the sun-baked earth, pulling carts, digging canals, standing in ration lines beneath a sky that offered little mercy and no excuses. They bowed before idols carved by other hands, followed rituals written in a language not meant to be questioned, and they found ways to persist, to love, to laugh, to lose, and through all of that, they left behind not legends, but evidence, scraps of life, a broken jug, a worn tablet, a house plan drawn in reeds, a record of grain owed and never paid. These fragments are all that remain of a million lives once vivid and now silent, and yet when we lie still and listen, truly listened, we can hear them, or at least, we can imagine what it felt like to be them, and imagination, in this space, is more than enough. So tonight, we will begin with a single, ordinary day in the life of someone who lived in Babylon around 2,600 years ago. A city surrounded by walls, tall enough to block not just enemies, but wind. A city where bureaucracy reached into every home, and where religion was not a belief but a system, a contract, a structure built from offerings and obedience. You will wake with them, rise with them, walk with them beneath the sharpness of the sun. You will drink what they drank, work as they worked, and feel the relentless rhythm of their hours, which belonged not to themselves, but to the temple, to the state, to the heat. You will come to understand why, though we marvel at Babylon today, you would not have lasted long within its walls. And yet there is beauty here, in the slowness, in the repetition, in the sameness of their days, broken only by seasonal floods and quiet festivals. There is something calming in their resignation, something almost peaceful in their lack of options. No distractions, no illusions of freedom, just a set path, walked by generation after generation, each footstep pressed into the same dust, each prayer whispered to the same silent sky. You are safe now. You are far from the noise of this century. The past is not hostile, it is tired. It asks nothing from you except that you be still, that you listen without judgment to the sound of ancient life unfolding like a slow, low lullaby. In the chapters ahead, you will encounter more than dust and hardship. You will hear of a city's fall, a quiet surrender rather than a war. You will question whether one of the world's greatest wonders ever truly existed. You will walk through a priest-king's chamber and notice how even the powerful were bound by rules, rituals, and fear. But for now, there is no need to look so far ahead. The world of then is opening slowly, one breath at a time, one heartbeat at a time. Let the noise of now continue to fall away. Let it recede behind you. Let it become irrelevant. The lights are dimming in your mind. The dust is thick in the air. The reeds rustle. The earth beneath your bare feet is cracked and warm. You are no longer here. You are no longer you. You are a worker in the shadow of temples, a body among thousands, a soul caught in the great stillness of the ancient past. The city has not yet awoken, but it will. And when it does, so too will your journey begin. Welcome to Babylon. You awaken slowly, not with a jolt, not to the harsh screech of alarm clocks or the sharp glow of artificial light, but to something gentler, something older. The air has not yet shifted into heat, but already there is a weight to it, a thickness that clings faintly to your skin like dust. You are lying on your rooftop where the nights are cooler, safer, and where the wind, if it comes at all, brushes softly across your face, carrying with it a blend of distant odors. Last night's cooking smoke still caught in the clay chimneys, the earthy scent of open canals, and the faint metallic temps of the Euphrates. Above you, the stars are just beginning to dim, but the sky is not yet lit. It is that liminal hour, neither night nor day, when the city breathes in quietly, before beginning its next long exhale. Around you, the sounds of Babylon are starting to re-emerge, not suddenly, but gradually, as if the city itself is reluctant to rise. A dog barks once and is silenced. Far off, a merchant's donkey lets out a tired guttural bray, shaking dust from its coarse mane. Closer, you hear the low creak of a wooden gate opening, someone preparing to haul goods to market before the heat rises. A few birds, small desert thrushes, perhaps, flutter past overhead, chirping tentatively, as if unsure whether it is truly time to sing. Somewhere, a boy calls out softly to his brother. Their voices float across rooftops like loose feathers, drifting, almost weightless. You do not move yet. The woven reed mat beneath you is thin, and though it protected you from the worst of the roof's hardness, you feel it now, the pressure in your hip, the dull ache in your back, the places where your skin pressed into uneven clay as you slept. Your arm is tingling from where you slept on it too long, and your feet are still gritty with yesterday's dirt, though the evening breeze cooled them as you lay down. Insects, too tiny, biting things, visited you in the night. You swatted them away without waking. You do not bother to check for bites. They are inevitable. Around your mat lie a few personal items. A clay jug half filled with stale water covered with a shard of broken pot to keep out flies. A worn head wrap coiled beside your sandals, a cloth pouch with a few leftover dates inside. You sit up slowly, your limbs heavy, your eyes still sticky with sleep, and look out over the city. Babylon stretches around you in every direction, low rooftops, uneven walls, narrow alleys, and the occasional silhouette of a ziggurat rising like a stairway toward the still dark heavens. The great temple district is to the east, beyond your line of sight, but you know it's already alive. You can hear it if you listen closely. The distant clang of bronze doors, opening, the soft rise of early prayers sung by temple boys, the ceremonial horns that mark the beginning of another ritual, another offering, another endless repetition of divine obligation. You rise slowly, your knees crack just a little, and the muscles in your back complain from yesterday's labor. Perhaps you carried grain sacks, or copied lines of cuneiform in the temple record house, or walked too far in the midday heat without enough water. You stand barefoot on the rooftop and stretch toward the dimming stars. The surface beneath your feet is rough and warm from the retained heat of the previous day, and small bits of gravel press into your soles. A few are sharp enough to draw a wince, but your feet are calloused. You descend the short wooden ladder into your home, one small room, thick-walled and windowless, with a low ceiling and a single reed curtain to separate sleeping from eating space. The air inside is stale, tinged with the smell of old ashes, oil, and sweat. You step across the compacted dirt floor and reach for the small basin in the corner. It is filled with water from yesterday's dross, stored overnight in a tall clay jar to keep it from heating. The water is not cold, not fresh, and it tastes faintly of minerals, but it will do. You splash your face, your neck, your arms. The sensation is bracing, momentarily cooling, and it lifts the veil of sleep from your eyes. The water drips onto your tunic, yesterday's laid out and still bearing creases from your work. You wipe your hands on a piece of cloth, coarse and worn, and reach for the small ceramic jar of scented oil. If you are lucky or pious, there is a dab left, pressed from herbs, perhaps a pinch of crushed myrrh or sweet marjoram mixed with animal fat. You rub a little behind your ears, along your neck. The scent is subtle but comforting. It hides the sweat, if only briefly, and gives the illusion of care, of cleanliness, of calm. you dress quickly. The linen tunic is simple, sleeveless, and slightly stiff from repeated wear. It hangs just below your knees, belted at the waist with a braided fiber cord. The fabric, coarse by modern standards, scratches lightly at the shoulders, but you are used to it. Beneath the tunic, you tie a short wrap of softer cloth for modesty and protection against the constant friction of motion. Your head wrap is a narrow strip of cloth, wrapped twice around your brow to catch sweat, and shield your scalp from the sun, now beginning to lighten the sky beyond the rooftops. It smells faintly of old salt and herbs. You slide your feet into your sandals' flat soles made of woven reed and leather, bound to your ankles with laces. Dust has already settled into the fibers, and the straps leave faint impressions on your skin. You will walk many steps today, and you know they will not be easy. Before you leave, you check the clay niche in the wall, where the household god resides. A small figurine sits there, carved with care, perhaps a likeness of Nabu, the god of writing, or of Marduk, the protector of the city. You touch your fingers to your forehead, your lips, then to the niche. There is no prayer spoken aloud, only a moment of stillness, a shared silence between you and the unseen. You step out into the alleyway and the day begins not suddenly, but with the soft blooming of light across baked mud walls. The sky is pale now, turning gold near the horizon. The city stirs around you. A woman sweeps dust from her threshold with a bundle of reeds. A boy carries a pail of water, struggling under its weight. An old man sits on a low stool, repairing the leather strap of a harness. The sounds of the market drift through the narrow lanes. Vendors arranging fish on woven mats. The low hum of bartering. The sharp cry of a seller hawking dried dates. You walk toward your duty, whatever it may be. A scribe's bench, a grain store, a warehouse, a canal. But for now, in this moment, you are just another body among many, another breath in the lungs of the city, another footstep pressed into the dirt. And the sun has not yet reached its full height. It is still gentle, still quiet, still low in the sky, but it is rising, and so are you. Food, in Babylon, was never extravagant for most, and it was rarely truly satisfying. It was predictable, repetitive, and yet deeply essential, not merely in the biological sense, but in the emotional one, anchoring each day with a pattern of preparation and consumption that gave some sense of order to lives governed by forces far beyond personal control. You would begin, typically, with porridge, not the creamy, spiced kind you might imagine today, but a thick, dense barley mash soaked overnight in water drawn from communal wells or stored in clay jars lined with reed to keep the sediment from collecting too deeply. The barley itself was coarse and uneven, often containing bits of holes or the occasional husk fragment missed during threshing. It had been ground by hand, usually between two stones or on a saddle quern, producing a texture more grainy than smooth. The grinding process, while ancient, was far from refined, and often fine particles of stone would mix into the grain without anyone noticing, or, if they did, they said nothing, for the meal had to be eaten regardless. These tiny inclusions meant that over the course of a lifetime, teeth would wear down not from sugar, as is common now, but from grit. It was simply part of life. The porridge would be heated in a clay pot over a small, open fire fueled by dried dung patties or palm husks, producing a smoke that clung to clothing, skin, and walls alike. The pot itself was often blackened from repeated use, its rounded bottom nestled into a ring of stones that kept it steady above the flames. As the mixture warmed, it thickened into a paste, not creamy, not delicate but heavy, clinging to the wooden spoon or ladle, sometimes with small bubbles breaking the surface in slow motion. Salt, when available, would be added sparingly, pinched between fingers and stirred in occasionally, if fortune or harvest had been kind. One might add dried herbs for flavor, thyme or coriander, but these were rare for common households. More likely, the only variation would come from the water itself, sometimes earthy, sometimes slightly alkaline, depending on the well from which it had been drawn. The end result was nutritious enough to fuel a day of work, but not particularly enjoyable. It filled the stomach, sat heavy within it, and allowed a person to carry on. Bread, however, was more central not just to the diet, but to the culture. It was made daily in nearly every home, shaped by hand, baked quickly, and eaten almost immediately. There were many forms: flat cakes, rounded loaves, even small ring-like portions meant to be carried to the fields. The most common was an unleavened flatbread, roughly oval in shape, made from barley or emmer wheat, mixed with water, and kneaded on a flat stone slab or shallow wooden trough. Oil was sometimes added to keep the dough from sticking, but more often it wasn't. Oil was precious and used sparingly. The dough was flattened by hand, dusted with flour or ash, and slapped directly onto the interior wall of a domed clay oven called a tanner, heated by fire until the outer surface blistered and browned. The baker would reach in carefully with tongs or padded hands, pull the bread free once it had puffed slightly, and let it cool on red mats spread across the floor. The result was not soft. The crust was tough, sometimes hard enough to crack when torn, and the interior dense and chewy. Depending on the quality of the grind, the bread might contain small bits of gravel, particularly near the edges. It wasn't uncommon to bite into a piece and feel the distinct crunch of a stone shard between them. And yet, this bread, this simple, tough, dusty bread, was the foundation of life in Babylon. It was broken and shared at every meal, used to scoop porridge, dipped into oil or brine, and eaten on the go. Children teethed on it. Laborers carried it tucked into their belts. Priests offered it to gods. Its texture, unyielding and dry, was as familiar as one's own breath. There was comfort in its constancy. Beer, however, was a different matter altogether. Unlike in the modern world, where beer is often associated with leisure, luxury, or celebration, in ancient Babylon it was essential, ordinary, and consumed daily by nearly every class of society. It was more nourishing than intoxicating a food, more than a drink, and made from the same barley that filled the porridge and the bread. But the brewing process was its own ritual, passed down across generations, maintained with precision even in the humblest homes. The process began with malted barley grain that had been soaked, sprouted slightly, then dried to stop the growth. This malt was ground and mixed with water into a mash, often with leftover bread or date syrup added to encourage fermentation. The mixture was left to sit in large clay jars for several days, covered loosely with palm fiber or cloth, and stirred occasionally with wooden paddles. As it fermented, it developed a yeasty aroma, sour, sweet, earthy, and a thick, cloudy texture. There was no filtration, no carbonation. The final product was a dense, porridge-like liquid, sometimes so thick it had to be chewed. It was rarely stored long. Most beer was consumed within a few days of brewing to prevent spoilage. It was scooped out in portions, often communally, using wide ceramic jugs known as karosu, which were shaped with narrow necks to control the flow and minimize sediment. To drink, one would often use a reed straw, long and hollow, inserted deep into the vessel to avoid the floating grain husks and sediment that settled at the top. Some families shared a jug between several people, sipping slowly, sometimes silently, especially in the early morning or late evening when the light was soft and the air quiet. The flavor of the beer depended heavily on the materials used, the water quality, the state of the grain, and the skill of the brewer. At its best, it was slightly sweet, slightly sour, with hints of malt and date. At its worst, it was acrid, bitter, or even mildly rotten. And yet, it was drunk anyway. It was safer than untreated water, more filling than broth, and easier to digest than hard bread alone. Children drank it, laborers drank it. Even temple priests, who were offered more refined versions, drank it regularly as part of ritual and daily sustenance. There were over a dozen recorded types of beer in Babylonian records, some thick, some thin, some spiced, some medicinal, but all of them were part of life's daily rhythm. A Babylonian day was not measured by clocks, but by tasks, meals, prayers, and drinks. And beer marked more than one of those hours. In the household, preparation of these foods was often communal. Women worked together, sometimes with daughters or servants, shaping dough, tending fire, and stirring pots with a rhythm that matched the steady pace of their world. There was no urgency, only repetition. The same steps, the same tools, the same movements, day after day. Over time, the gestures became automatic. Your hands knew what to do before your thoughts caught up. And in those long, slow mornings, surrounded by the smell of baking bread and fermenting grain, there was something close to peace, not joy, perhaps, not pleasure, but a grounded presence. You ate when you could, never as much as you wanted. You chewed slowly, not to savor, but to stretch the food. You drank quietly, to soothe the dryness in your throat. And when the morning meal ended, you stood, brushed the crumbs from your tunic, wiped your hands on your thighs, and stepped back into the day. Your stomach was not full, but it was no longer empty. And in Babylon, that was enough. As you step out into the waking streets of Babylon, the air greets you not with freshness, but with density, a kind of weight that presses low and wide, as if the city itself exhales slowly from the bricks upward, releasing the accumulated warmth of the previous day even before the sun has properly risen. The alleyway before you is narrow, the packed earth beneath your feet firm but uneven, cracked in places from the dryness of the climate and made slick in others by the damp trails left behind by water carriers or animals recently passed. The walls that form the corridor around you are made of mud, bricks and dried, porous, and roughly textured. They rise in staggered rows, some higher than others, patched in places with fresh mud where cracks had formed, evidence of hasty repair after the seasonal rains. The surface is coarse to the touch and carries a slight earthy scent, especially where the clay remains moist beneath reed awnings or shaded eaves. These buildings lean inward ever so slightly, as if nodding toward one another in shared exhaustion, creating an effective enclosure that amplifies every sound within. Some of the walls are hung with mats woven from dried reeds fastened at the top corners with clay pegs or wooden dowels, their fibers brittle and sun-bleached, rustling gently in the occasional breeze that snakes through the narrow space. These mats serve as shade, as privacy, and sometimes as makeshift signs for shop fronts that sell grain, dried fish, or small carved idols. Above you, the sky brightens into a dusty blue, while the ziggurat in the far distance catches the first true light of the sun its tears. Glowing faintly gold against the haze, the city begins to thrum around you, not in sudden bursts, but in layers, like sediment settling at the bottom of a clay jar. You hear a low hum, at first the indistinct murmur of voices blending together in the distance. The occasional cough, the squawk of birds startled from a roof beam. Then come sharper sounds, the clatter of a cartwheel hitting a loose stone, the bray of a mule resisting its yoke, the bark of a dog chasing a rat into a drainage trench. A vendor shouts something about lentils, another shouts louder about salt, and somewhere close, the high-pitched giggle of a child cuts through the soundscape like a reed flute. You glance down one of the side lanes and see two children barefoot, dusty-legged, laughing as they roll a clay disc along the ground with sticks. Their hair is matted from sleep and sweat, their tunics oversized and knotted at the shoulders. One of them holds a clay figure, possibly a lion or a bull, with chipped paint and missing ears, a treasured toy passed down through more than one set of hands. They stop playing as a pair of oxen trundle past, pulling a wooden cart loaded with sacks of barley and baskets of dates. The driver walks beside them barefoot, flicking a switch at the animals' flanks, muttering curses under his breath not meant for the animals, but for the day ahead. His face is lined with sun and dust. You pass close enough to smell the oxen's sweater, musky, organic scent mixed with the sharper tank of dung, fresh and drying. The cart creaks on wooden wheels banded with bronze, leaving shallow tracks in the soft earth as it moves on. Nearby, a woman stands outside her doorway, sweeping debris into the gutter with a fan-shaped broom made of tide twigs. She pauses to adjust the jug on her hip, then spits into the dust and resumes her task. Her child, too young to help, sits in the shade near her feet playing with a fragment of broken pot, tracing patterns in the dirt with one finger. The smells intensify as you turn toward the market street, an artery of life that cuts through the residential blocks with purposeful chaos. The air here is thick and complicated. First, the brine of fish, unmistakable and immediate, wafting from open baskets filled with salted river fish, their bodies stiff and their scales dulled by the curing process. Flies buzz low over the piles, shooed occasionally by the vendor's lazy hand. Beside the fishmonger is a booth selling onions, their sharp scent cutting through the salt. And beyond that, a stall with strips of sun-dried meat strung on ropes. Overhead, their surfaces cured and leathery, glistening slightly in the morning heat. The aroma of warm bread fresh from the oven mingles with the richer odor of roasting garlic and boiling lentils. A baker stands shirtless behind his oven, using long tongs to pull flat rounds of bread from its inner walls, stacking them quickly on a stone slab before handing them to waiting customers. His arms are burned from years of proximity to the flames, but he works without flinching. Each loaf is hard, hot, and speckled with bits of ash. Not far from him, an old man repairs baskets, his fingers working methodically through fronds of dried palm. He hums to himself something old, something familiar only to him, while beside him his granddaughter counts clay tokens used for trade. They are carved with small pictograms, symbols of goats and jugs and sheaves of barley, used in place of currency in transactions too small or too mundane to warrant silver. You pass them slowly, your ears catching fragments of conversation, arguments about price, gossip about a neighbor, complaints about the grain ration being short again this month. And through all of it, in the background like a persistent undertone, is the sound of metal striking metal. Somewhere nearby, a smith hammers a blade back into shape, the clang echoing off the close mud walls, reverberating with a dull insistence. It is not rhythmic, not musical, just one sharp strike after another, irregular but constant, like a heartbeat laboring beneath the weight of the city. Closer to the temple district, the sounds shift again. You hear voices raised in a different register, not the barter of the market, but the chant of prayer, the intonation of offerings being made. Young boys in linen sashes walk in lines carrying baskets of dates and small clay pots filled with oil. Their feet are bare, their heads shaved in the style of temple attendants, and their movements are slow, deliberate. From behind the great walls of the temple complex, you hear the deeper tones of adult priests, low, repetitive, unwavering, as they recite hymns written thousands of years ago in honor of gods who demand not belief, but consistency. Incense burns somewhere behind those walls, perhaps cedar resin or marand. The smoke curls above the clay roofline like a lazy thread unraveling into the sky. The scent carries faintly on the wind, blending briefly with the other smells of the street before it's lost again. In this moment, you are surrounded not by monuments, but by motion. Babylon is not a museum. It is a place alive with footsteps, burdens, and breath. People push carts laden with clay jugs. Goats wander unattended, nibbling at refuse. A boy chases a chicken with a stick. A woman squats near a doorway, scrubbing her child's feet with a wet rag. Dust coats everything: hair, skin, lips, clothes, and there is no escaping it. It rises with each passing stride, settles again between the cracks in the stone, paints the faces of statues and the ridges of clay walls. Overhead, the sun has now cleared the rooftops, casting sharp-edged shadows that stretch across the alleyways like broken lines drawn in haste. You pause in the shade, not to rest, but to watch. This is not your world, not really, but it becomes real in its sameness. In the way hands work, in the way children laugh, in the way mornings unfold with tasks to be done, food to be bought, obligations to be met. There is no grandeur here, no ceremony for your benefit, and yet, it is beautiful in its honesty. As the city of Babylon fully wakes, it does not do so with splendor but with persistence. With the friction of sandals on packed earth, with the scent of garlic and fish, with the murmur of commerce and prayer and repair. It is a place that does not need to impress you. It simply is. And you, for this moment, are part of it. There are many ways to serve in Babylon, but very few of them are gentle, and fewer still are free. Whether your duty lies in the silence of the scribal bench or in the noise of the open fields and crumbling canals, the work shapes you. It defines not only your day but your posture, your thoughts, your reputation, and your future such as it is. In a world where futures are rationed just like grain and beer, if your family was fortunate, or strategically devout, perhaps you were offered to the temple at a young age, not as a priest or acolyte, but as a scribe, destined to serve the city's lifeblood, its bureaucracy. The work begins in youth, not with grand philosophical study, but with repetition. Cuneiform is not a simple system, not something one can casually learn from exposure or intuition. It must be drilled, carved into muscle memory with a stylus of reed pressed into wet clay day after day until your fingers ache, your wrists grow stiff, and your mind begins to recognize the patterns, even when your eyes are closed. There is no alphabet, only wedge shapes, strokes, angles, groupings that take the form of language but behave more like a code. Your first months, maybe your first years, are spent copying symbols without knowing what they mean, practicing the angle, the depth, the spacing, until your teacher, a senior scribe with deep creases around his eyes and ink permanently embedded in his fingernails, tells you the tablet is acceptable. Only then do you begin the real work. You are assigned to a corner of the temple storehouse, perhaps beneath a low arch where the light is dim and the air smells of parchment, oil, and dust, surrounded by shelves of clay tablets, each one a record of something. Barley paid to a farmer, oil allotted to a priest, slaves transferred from one estate to another, contracts sealed with thumbprints and witnessed by men who hold the law in their memory. Your stylus, cut fresh each week, is your primary tool. Your clay, smoothed by hand, and occasionally moistened by a few drops of water, is your canvas. You copy, not poetry, not stories, but inventories, deliveries, debts. Sometimes you are tasked with recording sacrificial offerings: how many sheep, how many vessels of beer, how many jars of incense were brought to the temple on a given day. There is no room for creativity. Precision is the only virtue here. A single miswritten character, a symbol inverted, or a line too deep can change the meaning of a text, and this, in the temple's economy, is a serious offense. Once, ascribed to benches down from yours, misrecorded a royal name during the recopying of a land deed. He mistook one god's sign for another. The error was not discovered until the deed had already been fired and sealed. The result was confusion, insult, and a delay in the disbursement of land. The punishment was immediate. He was stripped of his privileges, no more incense, no more meat allotments, and reassigned to the lowest rank of scribe trainees. Despite his age, you didn't see him again for many months. Some whispered that he had been sent to work the temple gardens as penance. Others said he chose to leave altogether and become a trader's assistant. You don't ask. Errors are contagious. You keep your head down, your strokes deliberate, your posture straight. You eat your lunch with your knees tucked in, perched on the same reed mat you arrived with, careful not to smear your hands on your tunic. The day passes slowly, marked by the arrival of new tablets and the shifting light through the high slit in the temple wall. Your fingers are cramped by evening, your eyes sore, but your work is still clean. That is what matters. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, a different kind of labor unfolds, rougher, louder, harder in every way. If you are not a scribe, not a merchant, not connected by blood to a house of prestige, then you are likely one of the thousands whose hands keep the city standing. You wake earlier, you eat less, you carry more. If your duty is to the irrigation canals, and many aren't, then your day begins not with styluses and tablets, but with ropes and shovels. The canals are the veins of Babylon, feeding its crops, its livestock, and its people with the slow, life-giving trickle of Euphrates water. Without them, the fields die, and when the fields die, so too does the city. And so you rise, gather your tools, and walk the dry, cracked path to the water's edge, where the scent of silt and rotting reeds greets you like an old adversary. The work is rarely clean. You might be tasked with reinforcing a crumbling embankment, hauling baskets of wet clay to patch a breach, or you may need to dredge the canal bed, scooping out decades of compacted sediment with curved wooden shovels until your shoulders burn and your feet sink into the mud like stones. The sun rises quickly over the open plain, and soon your tunic is soaked through, not just with sweat, but with water and filth. Your hands blister, your back tightens, and still, the foreman shouts, pushing you to move faster. The city does not wait. Once, during the flood season, a section of the eastern canal collapsed without warning. The embankment, weakened by years of patchwork repairs and undermined by burrowing animals, gave way during the night. A roar of water surged through the fields, drowning a barley crop and sweeping away a small storage shed used for tax collection. By dawn, a dozen laborers had been summoned to contain the breach, working knee-deep in rushing water, forming a human chain to pass stones and sandbags. You were among them. The current pulled hard against your legs, and the mud beneath your feet shifted with every movement. A boy new to the work, perhaps only 13, lost his footing and was carried several meters downstream. Before someone grabbed him by the tunic, he survived, but the incident changed him. He worked more slowly after that, his eyes always watching the water, his hands trembling when holding a shovel. You sometimes think of that moment when the canal looks too calm. It reminds you that nothing in Babylon is stable, not the water, not the earth, not your place within it. You return home at dusk, your limbs shaking, your tunic stiff with drying muck, your skin patterned with abrasions. There is no bath, only a splash of water from a shed jug, just enough to wipe the worst from your face. You eat quickly, drink slowly, and lie down without ceremony. Sleep comes quickly, and dreams are often filled with the rhythm of work, the sound of shovels in mud, the creak of ropes, the sharp commands of men too tired to be kind. Whether you write in silence or labor in sweat, the result is the same. Babylon requires your body. It requires your time, your compliance, and your repetition. It is a city that thrives on the invisible work of thousands who are never named in inscriptions, never remembered in legend, and yet, without them, there is no Babylon. No temples, no kings, no gardens, or gates, or grandeur. Only silence and sand, and a memory that never formed. And so you work, day after day. Because to not work is to disappear. And Babylon, even in its vastness, does not mourn the disappeared. By the time the sun climbs to its unforgiving height, Babylon has begun to shimmer not with beauty or brilliance, but with a kind of distortion, a warping of the air itself as heat rises from every surface in visible waves. The earth beneath your sandals, once firm and cool in the morning, is now a burning plain, dry and brittle. Where it was cracked and sticky, where it has trapped the thin slime of canal water, fish brine, and the countless footsteps that tread its path, you can feel the heat radiating from below, not just around you, but rising up through your soles, warming your calves, curling into the fabric of your tunic, making the simple act of standing a conscious effort. The air is no longer something you breathe, it is something you press against, as though walking through a thick, dry cloth hung across every street and corner. It moves sluggishly, if at all, and when it does move, it carries with it not relief, but the bitter scent of sunburned dung patties, the sour sting of unwashed bodies, and the metallic hint of dust that stings your nostrils and clings to the back of your throat. Your lips, even if you licked them just minutes ago, are already dry again. They crack at the corners, and if you open your mouth too wide to speak, to cough, to sigh, you can feel the skin stretching painfully. You reach instinctively for your headscarf, adjusting it to cover more of your brow, pulling it lower over your neck, tucking it tighter behind your ears. The cloth is already damp from sweat, darkening in spots where it has absorbed the salt of your effort, and yet it serves as your only armor against the blaze above. It doesn't keep the heat out, it never could, but it filters the light, dulls the edge of the sun's sharp gaze, and provides the illusion of protection, which, in such conditions, can feel as vital as protection itself. Around you, the city has slowed. The streets are not empty, they never are, but they have shifted. Movements become more deliberate, more constrained. No one walks quickly now, unless they must. Even the animals, donkeys with glassy eyes, goats huddled beneath crude shelters, stand more still, conserving their breath, swishing their tails with lazy frustration. Traders at the market drape linen sheets across their booths, angling them to create shallow triangles of shade beneath which their wares rest. Pottery glows faintly in the heat, and fruit wilts before it can be sold. You pass a stall where dates have begun to sweat a thin sheen of sugar bubbling from their skins, pooling into sticky rivulets that attract insects who seem drunk on the heat themselves. A butcher wipes his brow with the same cloth he used to clean his knife. A woman refills her water jug and splashes the excess across the clay floor of her doorway, hoping the evaporation will cool the ground, if only for a few breaths. For those who can, this is the hour to retreat. Children are called indoors or ushered into courtyards where the shadows are deepest. Workers whose duties allow for pause withdraw beneath the eaves of storehouses, into the corners of porticos, or if fortune favors them, into the cool, thick-walled interiors of temple annexes where the stone floors hold traces of last night's coolness. There, among the scent of lamp oil and aging tablets, they sit with their backs to the wall, knees drawn up, heads lowered, breathing slowly. Conversation is minimal. Speech is work, and work is to be avoided if possible. But not everyone can stop, not every role permits rest. If you are on canal duty, the sun is an adversary you cannot avoid. The glint of water that once sparkled beneath morning light now glares too bright to look at, directly bouncing off the ripples like shards of molten bronze. The surface is deceptive, beautiful in its stillness, deadly in its heat. You dip your hands in it not to cool off, but to scoop mud or shift debris, and the water feels warmer than your skin. There is no refreshment here, no relief, just the knowledge that the work must continue, that the canal must be cleared, that the embankment must hold. You find what shade you can beneath a tilted cart left abandoned for the moment, its wheels partially buried in silt. The space beneath it is cramped, but the shadow it casts is enough to draw you in. You crouch there with your back against the wood, knees pressed to your chest, arms slack with fatigue. Around you, others have done the same, some under carts, some beneath scaffolding, others curled beneath low stretches of wall where the stone is still cool to the touch. Even the ziggurats, the towering temple of Marduk, visible from nearly every part of the city, offers shade at its base, and sometimes the outer courtyards are filled with men lying motionless, like animals sheltering from a midday storm. You do not sleep, you cannot. The heat makes sleep shallow, restless, a dream laced with sweat and dry mouth. But you drift. Your thoughts blur. The muscles in your arms twitch from overuse. Your vision, when you open your eyes again, swims briefly. You reach for your water, warm now, metallic tasting from the clay jug, but you drink anyway, rationing each swallow like silver. There will be more work. There is always more work. The scribes, too, suffer, though differently. Inside the temple archives, the thick walls offer insulation, but they also trap air. The windows, if they can be called that, are little more than slits near the ceiling, letting in shafts of light that move slowly across the floor like sundials, tracking time with oppressive certainty. The scent in the room is complex. Clay, parchment, sweat, oil, and the unmistakable odor of wet reeds slowly drying in the stylus bin. The scribes sit in rows, hunched over tablets, their breathing shallow, their faces glazed with sweat that catches in their eyebrows and drips occasionally onto their work. The clay dries faster in the heat, requiring more precision, more speed. A single pause, a moment's hesitation, can cause a tablet's surface to crack or stiffen before the text is complete. Then it must be discarded and begun again. No one speaks loudly. The only sounds are the scratch of stylus on clay, the shifting of sandals, the occasional sigh. A boy stands in the corner with a fan made of palm fronds, waving it in slow arcs toward the senior scribe. Not to cool him, for the fan barely moves air, but as a gesture of respect, of duty, of hierarchy. It is not the heat itself that makes the work unbearable, it is the expectation to continue as though the heat were not present, to perform with the same clarity, the same composure, the same exactness, as if the world were not smoldering around you. You press on, because to falter is to draw attention, and to draw attention in the scriptorium is never wise. And so Babylon at midday becomes a place of suspended movement, not because nothing happens, but because everything happens more slowly, more deliberately. The city does not stop. It cannot, but it bends. It yields to the sun's dominance, not with rebellion, but with grudging adaptation. Its people lower their voices, shorten their steps, narrow their ambitions to the next hour, the next swallow of water, the next shaded doorway. Even the dogs, usually so eager to chase and bark, lie flat on their sides, tongues lolling, their chests rising and falling in exaggerated rhythm. Above it all, the sky remains indifferent, vast, cloudless, endless in its expanse, like a kill with no door. And yet, in the silence of midday, in the slow turning of hours under unbearable heat, there is a kind of peace, a resignation that settles like ash, a rhythm that cannot be escaped, only endured. And when the sun finally begins to shift, to tip westward ever so slightly, casting longer shadows and softening the glare, you will feel it not as triumph, but as permission. Permission to move again, to rise, to speak, to continue. But until then, you are still. You are low to the ground, hidden from the blaze, clinging to what shade you can. And the city, for this hour, breathes shallowly, in unison, with you. Evening in Babylon arrives not all at once, but gradually, gently, as though the sun itself grows tired of its own brightness, and finally agrees to rest. The light changes, first softening from harsh gold to a dull bronze hue, that settles across the mud brick walls and flat rooftops in long horizontal strokes, like the final lines of a clay tablet being pressed by a careful hand. The shadows grow deeper, more comfortable, stretching lazily along the narrow streets and seeping into the cracks between stones. The air, though still warm, begins to shift, not cooling dramatically but shedding the suffocating weight of midday heat, becoming breathable again, if only slightly. This is the hour when the city begins to stir in a different rhythm, not with the urgency of morning or the survival instinct of noon, but with a slower, more domestic pulse. The laborers return from the canals, their tunics streaked with dirt and dried mud, shoulders sagging, their sandals dusty and worn thin at the soles. The scribes, too, step out from the cloistered darkness of temple walls, rubbing the stiffness from their wrists, blinking at the changing light, their heads heavy with names and numbers they no longer care to remember. The streets fill once more, not with carts or shouting merchants, but with families and neighbors, gathering not to trade or to argue, but to share what little they have: time, food, silence. In small courtyards and alley corners, fires are kindled, not blazing or roaring, but low and purposeful, built from dried dung patties and palm fronds, producing more smoke than flame, yet enough heat to warm a pot or toast a piece of bread. The scent is unmistakable, woody, bitter, faintly acrid, and it drifts through the neighborhood in slow waves, mingling with the smells of simmering lentils, crushed garlic, and wild onions. Women crouch beside the hearths, stirring pots with wooden spoons worn smooth by years of use, adding water sparingly, measuring oil with practiced hands. A stew simmers, not thick, not rich, but enough to flavor the flat bread torn into it by calloused fingers. Children sit nearby, legs crossed, mouths open, watching as each ingredient is added like a spell being cast. The familiar ritual of food preparation, as comforting as the food itself. Conversation is muted, punctuated by the occasional laugh, the whisper of gossip, the low murmur of shared burdens. Nearby, a man repairs a broken bucket with a strip of bronze wire, his fingers nimble in the fading light. Another untangles a fishing net, his movements slow and methodical. These are the tasks of unwinding, of quiet continuation. As the food finishes, bowls are shared, crude pottery, mismatched and chipped, passed hand to hand without ceremony. No one eats in isolation. Even the poorest among them sit shoulder to shoulder with others, dipping bread into the same pot, drinking beer from the same jug. Their voices low, their chewing deliberate. The beer is warm by now, its sediment settled at the bottom of the jug, its taste slightly sour, but familiar. It coats the throat, calms the stomach, and takes the edge off the hunger that the stew could not satisfy alone. Nearby, the household god watches. Each home has one, maybe more, tucked into a niche in the wall, placed atop a small altar of stacked bricks, or set upon a ledge high above the reach of children's hands. These gods are not always grand. Some are carved from soft stone, others from clay, shaped with care, but without extravagance. A figure with wide eyes and outstretched arms, or a symbol pressed into the surface of a blackened pot. They are household protectors, not distant deities of storm or conquest, but spirits of the home, of fertility, of daily sustenance. And as the meal ends, the family turns toward them not with pomp or flourish, but with practiced intimacy. A piece of bread is placed at the base of the niche. A few drops of oil are poured from a shell or a small jug. Someone, usually the eldest, or the mother, whispers a prayer, not in grand poetic phrases, but in the plain, tired words of the end of a long day. Protect us, feed us, keep us safe. The children imitate the motion, the men bow their heads, the fire flickers, and for a moment the only sound is the pop of air escaping a lentil at the bottom of the pot. As darkness deepens, families climb once more to the rooftops. The interior of the home is too warm now, having absorbed the heat of the day through its thick brick walls. There are no windows to let in a breeze, only the rooftop above, where air can move freely and stars can be seen. The climb is short, just a few steps, often a simple ladder propped against the wall, but it feels like a transition. A passage from the world of labor to the world of rest. Mats are unrolled where they had been stored earlier, shaken lightly to release the dust, then laid flat on the warm clay surface. A few bring pillows, though many simply fold their tunics into a cushion. The night sky stretches overhead, vast and heavy with stars, unobscured by smoke or cloud, glowing softly in its ancient arrangement. The moon hangs low, casting a pale sheen across the rooftops, and in the distance, the silhouette of the ziggurat looms, a quiet reminder of the gods and the city's unyielding structure. But here, on the roof, those concerns feel far away. The wind, if it comes, is gentle and dry, moving over your skin like a breath, cooling the sweat that still lingers on your brow and the back of your neck. You lie down, adjusting the folds of your tunic, pulling your headscarf over your eyes to block the glow of the moon or the flicker of distant torches. The sounds of the city settle around you, still present, but softened by distance. A neighbor clears his throat. A child whimpers in a dream. Somewhere a dog barks once, then is silent. The fire in the courtyard crackles faintly, then dims. You hear the call of a temple priest, his chant drifting across the rooftops in long, mournful tones, too distant to understand, yet familiar enough to recognize. It is a prayer for the night, for the safe passage of dreams, for protection from spirits that wander after dark. The chant ends, and in its place is the sound of crickets in the reeds, the occasional flutter of wings overhead, the quiet hush of a breeze finding its way between buildings. You close your eyes, not all at once, but gradually, the way the city does. Your body feels heavy now, not from fatigue alone, but from the satisfaction of routine completed. The day has ended, not with fanfare but with small rituals, bread broken, prayers whispered, mat unrolled. You do not know what tomorrow will bring. The same work, most likely, the same heat, the same silence, but that is for later. For now, you let the stillness wrap around you like a second tunic, soft and invisible, heavier than air and lighter than memory. You let your breath slow. You feel the cool clay beneath your mat. You listen to the sleep sounds of a city that never truly rests, but knows how to pretend. And in this moment, you belong not as a visitor, not as a tourist of time, but as someone who has lived this day, felt its weight, shared its bread, whispered its prayers. The stars do not blink, the wind does not ask questions, the gods do not speak, and the night stretches onward. And as the moonlight stretches quietly across the rooftop, as the city exhales into its second stillness, the stillness of sleep, not of pause, you begin to realize that what you've just lived, in this imagined day, was not unusual, not exceptional, not difficult in the way modern language defines difficulty, but rather, it was typical, latterly and relentlessly typical, and that is exactly what made it so hard. This day, like all the others, was built from sameness, the same food, the same steps, the same words spoken to the same people in the same sequence, not by accident, but by design. Life in Babylon, for most, was a closed circuit shaped by calendars carved into clay, harvests governed by stars, decisions made far beyond your reach by priest kings and scribes whose names you might never hear, whose faces you would never see. It was a world where everything essential to survive for water, grain, salt, shelter, time itself flowed through bureaucratic hands, weighed and counted and recorded and verified, long before it ever touched your own. You were not free in any modern sense of the word. You did not choose your work. You did not question your ration. You did not opt out of your temple obligations. And should you protest gently, even politely, the answer would not come in the form of debate or discussion, but in a withheld loaf, a lost place in line, a missed opportunity when your name was skipped from the list, scratched hastily into wet clay. Scarcity in Babylon did not always mean famine. It meant something quieter, more grinding, the constant not-enoughness of life, not enough grain in the sack, not enough time in the shade, not enough oil in the lamp to finish your task without rushing. It meant that everything you used had already been used by someone else, your tools handed down, your clothes patched twice, your words rehearsed in the mouths of your elders. Even your breath was borrowed from those who came before, shaped by expectations so old they were no longer explained, only performed. And you performed them not because you believed, but because to stop would be to vanish. Scarcity was not a crisis here, it was the atmosphere. You lived in it, breathed it, slept in it, and carried it with you in your posture, in the way you looked at food, in the way you tightened your belt after eating, out of habit rather than hunger. Bureaucracy, too, was not the frustration of a single bad day at the wrong window, it was your entire interface with the divine. The gods, after all, were not accessed through emotion or meditation, but through structure offerings, rituals, tablets, tokens. Even belief was systematized. You didn't feel your devotion, you measured it by the weight of grain you offered, the hours you stood in prayer, the sequence of names you recited without error. It was a world in which even the sacred was subject to accounting. If your goat was injured, you filed a claim. If your irrigation schedule changed, you waited for approval. If your grain portion was short, you appealed, not to justice, but to a man with a tablet and a stylus who looked at you without seeing you, who noted your number and sent you away. Life was not chaotic. It was deeply, oppressively ordered, but the order was never yours. And so, the hardship came not just from labor or hunger or heat, but from the dull ache of repetition, from waking each morning not to possibility, but to confirmation. Yes, today will be the same. Yes, the line will be long. Yes, the bread will be tough. Yes, the sky will be too bright. And no, you will not be remembered. There is no journal waiting for your thoughts. No free hour waiting for your dreams. No time carved out for self-reflection. There is only work, rest, and the rituals in between. And yet, within this confinement, there was a rhythm, a slow, enduring pulse, that allowed people to survive in spite of everything. The body, once broken in, learns its roots. The hands, once calloused, know their tasks. And even the mind, weary though it may be, begins to accept the narrow path as sufficient. But you, modern listener, would not adjust so easily. Your muscles, untrained for constant repetition, would ache in new places before noon. Your appetite, spoiled by variety, would revolt at the sameness of the food. Your patience, accustomed to immediacy, would crumble beneath the weight. And more than that, your sense of self, your belief in autonomy, your expectation of being heard, of having options, of mattering, these would dissolve in days, perhaps hours. In Babylon, you are not exceptional, you are not special, you are not even an individual, in the sense you now understand the word. You are a function, of your family, of your guild, of your block, of your temple. You belong to others before you belong to yourself. And the self, in this place, is not a story to be told, it is a duty to be fulfilled. So when you imagine yourself here, truly here, not as an observer, not as a ghost, but as a resident of this dust-colored world, ask yourself how long you would last. How long before the hunger became more than discomfort? How long before the lack of privacy, of choices, of voice began to unmake you? How long before you missed the small luxuries you now mistake for burdens, the sound of music at the push of a button, the cold water from a tap, the fabric that does not scratch, the silence that is not threatened, the sleep that is not interrupted by insects, or the ache of hard clay beneath your ribs? You would not last long, and that is not a failure. It is simply the truth. You were made for another world, just as they were made for this one. But it is worth remembering that they endured, not because they were stronger or wiser, but because they had no illusions of escape. Their resilience was not a triumph, it was a condition, and in some quiet, respectful way, it deserves to be remembered, not glamorized, not pitied, simply seen. You lie there now at the end of this imagined day, staring up at stars you've never named, listening to the soft sounds of sleep around you. And you carry this knowing with you, that the world was once like this, that lives were once like this, that a day could be so full and so empty at the same time, that people could give their entire breath to a single ordinary life and never once be mentioned. And yet, they mattered, because you are thinking of them now. Because, for a moment, you walked in their sandals. Because you remembered. And sometimes, remembrance is enough. Before Babylon fell, before the name Cyrus passed between lips in cautious whispers, before the river bent its course, and the gates lay open to a new sovereign, the city stood not only as a place, but as a statement, a declaration of permanence carved into clay, stone, and ritual. Babylon was more than a settlement. It was a system so complete, so woven into the fibers of the known world, that to its inhabitants, it must have seemed as though it had always existed, and would always continue, not because of brute force or divine right alone, but because it was built on something even more durable, organization. The physical body of Babylon was immense, yes, but its true strength lay in structure, in predictability, in the illusion that control was not only possible, but guaranteed. Walk through its gates, and you were entering more than a city, you were entering a design, an architecture of reality built layer by layer over centuries, each generation expanding what the last had begun. And those gates, great bronze-hinged thresholds named for gods and stars, were not symbols of welcome, but of pride. The city's walls, famously impenetrable, wrapped around it in great concentric rings of baked mud brick, kill-fired for durability, wide enough at their summits for 2 chariots to ride side by side with room between them for a soldier on foot. These walls were not built in haste. They were not improvised. They were the product of centuries of work, maintained with seasonal inspections, and constantly improved by laborers whose names did not appear in records, but whose fingerprints remained on every sun-dried brick. The walls had texture, not just physical, but emotional. From afar, they shimmered in the sunlight, not because of ornamentation, but because of the evenness of their construction. From within, they offered silence and coolness, their shadowed interiors a haven from the sun, and for those few who lived close enough to climb them or serve upon them, guards, messengers, engineers, they offered a view so complete, so expansive, that it gave the illusion of omniscience. One could look down on the city and believe they understood it, believe they controlled it. From these heights, one could see the division of space temple precincts marked by soaring ziggurats, administrative quarters ordered into neat blocks, residential districts humming with small activity, and markets layered in patterned chaos. But beneath that visible form was the engine of Babylon, its administration. Unlike many empires whose power lay in conquest or wealth alone, Babylon thrived on documentation, on counting, on recording the movement of things, grain, sheep, bricks, incense, oil, and people. The temple was not just a house of worship, it was a government building, a warehouse, a calendar, a court. Priests were not merely spiritual guides, they were accountants, astrologers, scribes, and legal arbiters. When someone offered a goat in ritual, that goat was logged. When a farmer brought barley as tax, the barley was weighed, measured, sealed, and its receipt etched into wet clay in wedge-shaped symbols by scribes trained since childhood to never deviate, never abbreviate, never abbreviate, never assume. Babylon did not allow for vagueness. The gods did not speak in metaphor, they spoke in numbers, in proportions, in ritual cycles that required perfect performance and absolute fidelity. A missed step, an altered hymn, a miscounted measure of oilet was not just an error, it was a disruption in the balance of things, and so everything was watched, everything tabulated. Even the shadows cast by the ziggurat at different times of year were measured and recorded, their lengths interpreted for omens. Life in Babylon, if not luxurious, was secured by this belief in control. There were systems for everything. Systems for weighing fish, for storing clay tablets, for assigning days of rest, for determining who could marry and when. Contracts were not vague promises, but formal texts with witnesses and clauses and seals, and people followed them. They followed them because they had seen what happened to those who did not, those who failed to tithe at the right time, who broke contracts, who attempted to bypass temple dues. The punishments were rarely theatrical. They were worse than that. They were procedural. A name removed from the ration list, a plot of land reassigned, a debt doubled and enforced by the quiet machinery of temple scribes. It was not violence that frightened people, it was erasure, the knowledge that the system could simply forget you. And within this framework, people thrived in their own way. Not by modern standards. Perhaps there was no comfort in the material sense, no abundance for the many, but there was a form of predictability, and from that predictability emerged a kind of confidence. The baker knew he would sell bread because people needed bread, and the records ensured grain would continue to flow into the city. The canal worker knew when the water would be diverted, because it had always been so, and the tablets said it would be again. The temple singer knew the order of hymns for every festival, and so could rehearse in advance, knowing her performance would not change with a whim. The gods, while terrifying, were also dependable in their demands. And so the city breathed in rhythm. Wake, work, wash, eat, tithe, rest. The festivals came and went, marked by the booming sound of drums and the slow processions of priests in embroidered robes. The fields were planted, harvested, taxed. The stars wheeled above, and were tracked with careful notation. There were years of drought, of course, of disease, of war on the far reaches of the empire. But the city itself, walled, accounted for, wrapped in rituals, seemed eternal. Siege, to most Babylonians, was not a serious concern. The outer gates were massive. The river ran through the city. The granaries were stocked. The army, if not the largest, was loyal. And beyond all that, the gods themselves dwelt here not abstractly, but in real terms. Their idols were housed in sanctuaries, their names carved into stone. Their priests walked the streets. Who would dare attack the city of Marduk? Who would believe themselves strong enough, sanctioned enough, to violate the home of the god who created order itself? This was not arrogance. It was logic, by Babylonian standards, and so the people lived in a kind of slow, steady trust. They built their homes with brick made from the same mud as their ancestors. They cooked their meals on hearths inherited from mothers and grandmothers. They sent their children to learn the same symbols, to chant the same prayers, to wait in the same lines. Babylon was not a place that changed. It was a place that confirmed. And so, when the end came, it was not felt at first as terror or crisis. It came as confusion, then silence, then something else entirely, a kind of mourning, not for what was lost, but for what had been proven false. But that is still ahead. For now, the city remains untouched. The sun gleams softly off the ziggurat. The river flows steadily. The scribes are recording. The priests are preparing for another ritual. And beyond the walls, the desert stretches endlessly. Cyrus has not yet come. The river has not yet been turned. The gates have not yet opened. For now, Babylon still believes in itself. Before any soldier approached the gates, before a single torch was lit, Babylon had already begun to unravel, not from the outside in, but from the very center outward. Its walls stood tall. Its river flowed reliably. Its markets remained busy. But the pulse beneath the sacred rhythm of priest, king, god, and people had been interrupted. And in Babylon, such a break was more than political inconvenience. It was cosmological dissonance. To understand the city's slow implosion, you must understand the gravity of ritual. Babylon was not merely governed, it was constantly, ritually recalibrated. Each year at the moment when the sun passed into the sign of Aries and the barley fields shimmered in the southern wind, the city reenacted its cosmic birth during the Akitu festival, the New Year rite of renewal and divine legitimacy. This was not a celebration in the modern sense. It was a theological operation, precise and indispensable. The high priests brought the statue of Marduk, Lord of Order and Creation, from his temple to a temporary dwelling. There, for several sacred nights, ritual hymns were sung, incantations recited, and drama performed. Marduk's defeat of chaos reenacted in voice and symbol. The king, in turn, was stripped of his regalia, humiliated by the priests, slapped across the face, and forced to declare that he had not abused power, that he had honored the gods, that he had upheld law. Only when the priest confirmed that the king had wept truly, wept would his crown be returned. Then, and only then, was the city considered realigned with the heavens. Without this annual ritual, Babylon drifted, and during the reign of Nabonidus the drift became a rupture. Nabonidus was not a weak man, but he was an unconventional one. He favored the moon god Sin over Marduk, and his theological preferences were more than personal, they were politically destabilizing. To elevate Sin was to deprioritize Marduk, and in Babylon, this was not merely blasphemous, it was dangerous. Nabonidus did not spend most of his reign in Babylon. He absented himself, retreating for long periods to Tema, a distant city in Arabia, leaving his son Belshazzar to rule in his place. To many, this abdication of ritual responsibility was worse than any invasion. Without the king's presence, the Akitu festival could not be properly performed. Without Akitu, the world was not ritually renewed. Without renewal, chaos lurked just beneath the surface of every transaction, every harvest, every day. The priests, responsible for safeguarding the city's divine alignment, found themselves adrift, left to perform empty ceremonies, to offer truncated prayers to a god whose image remained locked in his shrine, unprocessed, uncelebrated. Resentment grew slowly, like salt in the soil, and resentment, in Babylon, was a dangerous crop. Belshazzar, Nabonidus' son and co-regent, lacked the legitimacy to perform many of the king's sacred duties. He could enforce the law, command the army, oversee markets, but he could not receive Marduk's renewal. He could not stand in the temple and declare the city reborn. To the public he was present yet incomplete, visible but not luminous. His rule felt administrative, not spiritual, and in Babylon the difference was everything. The people endured his governance with a sense of drift, like passengers in a boat with no tiller, no wind, only the memory of motion. And though the streets remained orderly, something had shifted in the silences between rituals. The temple singers still sang, but their voices were thinner. The priests still offered grain and incense, but they did so without the magnetic certainty that had once held the people in place. The markets still opened each morning, but merchants began to mutter about taxes increasing, about officials changing grain quotas mid-season, about shipments delayed without explanation. Complaints that once would have been whispered were now spoken at full volume. Canal workers found themselves paid late. Scribal apprentices noted supply shortages in the temple libraries, red styluses harder to come by, ink diluted, wages cut. These were not rebellions. They were signs, small but accumulating, that the spine of the city was no longer held straight. Even the astrologers, the elite readers of the heavens, began to note unusual omens: a lunar eclipse during harvest, an owl sighted within the temple courtyard, dreams recounted with too much fire, too much water, too many serpents. In a city where the divine was bureaucratic and the bureaucratic was divine, these signs were not dismissed. They were logged and interpreted. Whispers became annotations. Annotations became warnings, and still Nabonidus did not return. Still the statue of Marduk remained unprocessed. Still the Akitu festival passed unperformed. And somewhere in the palace, Belshazzar drank deeply from the sacred vessels meant only for ritual, a gesture later recounted as arrogance, but perhaps born more of despair. What can a placeholder king do, after all, when the mechanisms of his city no longer connect to the heavens, when the rituals no longer respond, when the priests look through him, not at him? Perhaps he drank to remember, or perhaps, more likely, to forget. Meanwhile, the city's outer guards remained alert, but untested. The army still trained, but its loyalties were unclear. To the average Babylonian scribe, porter, brewer, mother, the empire still appeared intact. The walls still stood, the river still flowed. But those who understood the structure beneath the elite, the priesthood, the seasoned administrators felt the tremor. The gods, it seemed, were no longer listening. And worse still, perhaps they had turned their ears elsewhere. The fear was not that Babylon would fall. The fear was that it already had, in ways not yet visible. That Marduk had vacated his shrine, not in image, but in presence. That the rituals, so carefully preserved and performed, were no longer being received. That the great city had become a stage with no audience, and in this quiet erosion, Cyrus became possible, not yet present, not yet approaching with banners or battalions, but already sensed. He was the name in the distance. The question whispered by those who once had answers: if he came, would the priests resist? Would the markets close? Would the soldiers fight? Or would they, like so many others in the empire's history, simply remove one seal, affix another, and continue? The faith that once upheld Babylon was shaken, not by violence, but by absence. The absence of the king, the absence of ritual, the absence of divine feedback. And into that void, history would step, but not yet. For now the city remained formally unbroken. The tablets continued to be inscribed, the grain continued to be measured, but within the temples, the sacred air felt thinner. And outside the temples, in the homes of the citizens, hope had softened into habit. A once living rhythm was now only repetition. And repetition, without purpose, can only endure so long. Long before his shadow stretched across Babylon's walls, long before the Euphrates was rerouted and the city's gates stood quietly ajar, Cyrus of Persia was already moving through the world, not as a mere king, but as something far more enduring, a symbol of inevitability. His approach to conquest did not resemble the chaotic hammer blows of typical empire building. He did not arrive screaming through fire, demanding submission, setting cities to the torch in the name of vengeance or dominion. No, Cyrus's genius lay in the soft-footed method of replacing not just rulers, but expectations of convincing cities, not that they had been defeated, but that they had been rescued, and more than that, restored to the order the gods had always intended. In an ancient world thick with violence, Cyrus was an anomaly, a king who conquered not just through military might, but through narrative, psychology, and precision timing. To understand why Babylon eventually opened to him without a fight, you must first see how he shaped himself not only as a man, but as a message. From his earliest campaigns, Cyrus made it a point not to obliterate the institutions of the lands he absorbed, but to preserve them publicly, reverently, and, above all, strategically. When he conquered Media, he married into the royal family, maintaining continuity rather than imposing disruption. When he turned west toward Lydia, he allowed its administrators to retain many of their roles, giving locals the illusion of preserved autonomy while subtly redirecting loyalty upward, toward himself. And most crucially, when he entered Elam and later the cities of Mesopotamia, he ensured that the local gods were honored with meticulous care. He restored temples, he bowed before idols. He issued proclamations, sometimes in the local languages, that acknowledged divine legitimacy not as something he claimed, but something he recognized. Cyrus did not ask cities to abandon their gods, he suggested, instead, that their gods had chosen him. In this, he did more than conquer. He became divine will made tangible. He wove himself into the cosmology of the people he absorbed. This strategy, part humility, part imperial sleight of hand, proved devastatingly effective. Cities that had once resisted foreign powers with fire and blood now watched as Cyrus approached and weighed their odds, not in terms of survival, but in terms of theological alignment. To resist him, one had to believe the gods did not favor him, and Cyrus made such disbelief increasingly difficult. Before approaching Babylon, he had already established a model of conquest that emphasized mercy, continuity, and sacred legitimacy. He allowed deported peoples to return to their homelands. He returned sacred vessels stolen by previous regimes. He even issued decrees such as the famous statements recorded on the Cyrus cylinder, declaring that he had been chosen by the gods, not just Persian gods, but local gods, to restore justice, to liberate the oppressed, and to purify the land. These declarations were not passive, they were seeded, distributed, whispered. Cyrus understood that conquest began not at the gate, but in the mind, and in Babylon, a city drifting in theological uncertainty, such whispers took root. As Nabonidus alienated the priesthood by favoring the moon god Sin, and as the Akitu festival went unperformed year after year, Cyrus's image began to take shape not as a threat, but as a possibility. And then, with subtle precision, it began to morph into destiny. There is evidence, scattered, partial, but compelling, that prior to his entry into Babylon, hymns were composed declaring Cyrus as the instrument of Marduk himself. These texts do not read like after-the-fact justifications. Their structure suggests they were meant to prepare the population to condition the priesthood, the scribes, and perhaps the citizenry for a theological pivot. In these writings, Marduk, Babylon's great city god, and the divine architect of order, is said to have grown displeased with Nabonidus, displeased with his neglect, displeased with his unperformed rituals, displeased with the confusion that now seeped through the rituals that had once kept creation in balance. Marduk, they said, had gone searching for a new shepherd, a king who would restore the ancient harmony, who would honor the divine hierarchy, who would respect the temple and serve the people. And that shepherd, conveniently, was already approaching from the east. Such hymns, if not directly authored by Persian propagandists, were certainly tolerated by Cyrus's envoys and likely spread with gentle encouragement. He did not need to storm the ziggurat. He only needed the priests to begin imagining him inside it, and perhaps, by the time he arrived, they already had. His success was not just the product of military brilliance, it was the triumph of narrative timing. Babylon was weakened, not in its walls or soldiers, but in its ritual confidence, and Cyrus stepped into that weakness with a serenity that mirrored the city's own values. He promised not revolution, but restoration, not new gods, but renewed respect for the old ones, and the discontented elites, the scribes weary of broken festivals, the priests who felt their authority drifting, the merchants taxed into uncertainty. They did not see him as an invader, they saw him as an answer. It's not impossible, or even unlikely, that prior to his arrival, emissaries from Cyrus had already been in contact with key Babylonian figures. Negotiations, subtle and veiled, could have offered assurances. Your position will be protected, your temple will be funded, your God will be revered. If Babylon surrendered peacefully, if the gates were opened, no blood would be shed, no idols desecrated, no grain stores looted. Such diplomacy, conducted behind scrolls and seals, may have done more to open the city than any army ever could. After all, Babylon's greatest fear was disorder, and Cyrus offered a new kind of order, one that required only a change in name, not in structure. The scribes would still write, the priests would still chant, the markets would still hum, but the king's seal would bear a new shape, his crown would rest on a new brow, and perhaps most importantly, the rituals would return. The Akitu festival would be performed again, Marduk would be honored, the rhythms of the city would be restored. Cyrus knew exactly what Babylon needed to hear, and he said it, not through shouted declarations, but through coordinated symbols, calculated mercy, and careful alignment with the very cosmology that held the city together. By the time his soldiers approached, many in the city had already surrendered, not physically, but ideologically. They were ready. And Cyrus.com uncertain merely walked into the space that had already been cleared for him, not by weapons, but by anticipation. When Babylon fell, it did so in silence, not the absence of sound, but a hush so broad and total it became a presence of its own. There were no horns, no drums, no clash of bronze against shield. There was no smoke rising above the ziggurats, no fires licking the walls, no siege towers crumbling in flame. The fall was not broadcast, it was not even announced. It happened in the space between breaths, in the pause between one shift of guards and the next, in the cool hush of a night when the stars still turned in their ordered rhythms above a city that believed itself still untouched. And it began with water, the Euphrates, the river that split Babylon like a sacred vein. Flowing beneath the city's gates and feeding its canals, had always been both lifeline and boundary. It brought fish, silt, fertility, and drink. It connected neighborhoods and formed a liquid barrier that enemies could not cross. Babylon's architects had trusted in the river's constancy, had designed their defenses around its flow, had assumed that what moved through their city in gentle current could not be turned against them. But Cyrus, methodical and watchful, saw something different. He did not assault the walls with ladders or try to starve the city into submission. Instead, he focused on the river itself, not as a defensive blessing, but as a vulnerability to be patiently upstream from the city, in long, dry stretches of land where the Euphrates narrowed and meandered. Cyrus's engineers began the quiet work of redirection. They did not shout, they did not boast, they dug trenches and canals, parallel diversions that curved away from the river's main path. It was slow labor, dusty and repetitive, done under the cover of strategy, not storm. These workers, Persian and Median and possibly even Babylonian defectors, worked with tamped-down urgency. They raised dikes. They reinforced banks. They prepared a place for the river to go once it was told to go elsewhere. It was, in effect, a slow unthreading of Babylon's security, a preparation not for destruction, but for rerouting, a conquest of currents when the channels were ready and the moon was right, and the Babylonian defenders were distracted by the rhythms of a festival. Or so some sources claim. Cyrus gave the command. Dams were released. Channels opened. The river did not stop, but it changed. Its water flowed sideways, disappearing from its traditional bed-like breath, exhaled in another direction. And in that newly shallow course beneath Babylon's great gates, once neck-deep, now no higher than the shin, his soldiers stepped lightly through. They did not wade through torrents. They did not struggle. They walked. The mud sucked at their sandals. The silt clung to their calves. Their spears were slung low, not raised. They moved like phantoms, not warriors. And the walls, immense and layered and trusted for generations, did nothing, for they had not been breached. They had simply been circumvented. Within the city, the air was unchanged. The night unfolded as it always did, marked by incense smoke curling from rooftop shrines by guards, shifting at their posts with the lazy cadence of routine by merchants, closing their shutters and children chasing the last moments of moonlight. The people of Babylon had no reason to fear. There had been no siege. The fields beyond the walls were still green. The markets were stocked. No battering rams waited at the gates. There was no sign of distress. And so, as the soldiers entered beneath walls, through channels once meant for boats and irrigation, they met no resistance. There were no volleys of arrows, no alarm raised by watchmen. Perhaps at first, they were not even noticed. A sentry, drowsy from long duty, might have blinked and seen nothing amiss, only the river. A little low perhaps, and the shadows thicker than usual near the banks. Perhaps a dog barked, then quieted. Perhaps a priest, waking in the early hours to prepare offerings, heard a footstep that did not belong and thought it the echo of his own. The soldiers dispersed into the city's districts with care. No looting, no burning, no triumphant cries. Their instructions were clear: subdue without spectacle, control without chaos. This was not a victory to be celebrated. It was a transition to be smoothed. The gates, once sealed with bronze and watched by dozens, opened not with violence but with keys, perhaps already in the hands of those who had agreed in silence to let them turn. Some say it was treachery. Others say it was foresight. Still others believe it was Fatiga's city, weary of waiting for ritual that never came, ready to embrace any hand that promised to restore order. Regardless, the gates opened. The river carried no alarm, and the city, when it awoke, found itself already taken. The temple of Marduk was untouched. His statue, long denied the renewal of a Kichu, now looked out upon new gods not Persian in dress, perhaps, but new in name and allegiance. The priests, long estranged from Nabonidus and uncertain of Belshazzar's legitimacy, were not dragged from their chambers. Instead, they were addressed, honored, offered restoration, offered continuity under a different crown. They did not resist. They did not need to. Cyrus had no interest in dismantling the mechanism. He only needed it to spin in his direction. Across the city, the scribes picked up their statistics. They did not scratch out records in haste. They did not burn archives or hide clay tablets beneath floorboards. They simply adjusted the date, the seal, the name of the king. The ledgers remained the same. The barley tallies unchanged. The temple accounts balanced. For the average Babylonian, the shift may have been so subtle that it was only perceived weeks later when a soldier's accent was different, or when the new governor's decree bore a seal, unfamiliar but finely inscribed. The markets reopened. The water returned to its normal course. The chants resumed, and yet something was different. A sense, perhaps, that the gods had made a decision in the night, that Marduk, long silent, had now spoken not through lightning or plague, but through the absence of struggle, a conquest that felt less like intrusion and more like correction. Cyrus did not enter the city with pomp. He did not parade himself through the streets in golden armor. When he finally arrived, it was measured, almost ceremonial. He paid respects. He bowed where expected. He allowed his image to be shaped by the city, not imposed upon it. And so, Babylon did not fall. It shifted, it turned, it rewrote its own script. And that, perhaps, was Cyrus's greatest brilliance, not that he overcame Babylon, but that he allowed Babylon to believe it had corrected its course, that it had finally aligned again with divine will. The walls still stood, the river still flowed, the stars still turned, but the name at the center of it all had changed. And yet no one could point to the exact moment. Was it when the river shifted, when the first sandal touched the city's floor, when the priests whispered Marduk's new choice behind incense-curtained doors? History does not always leave a scream. Sometimes it leaves only a pause. When Babylon surrendered, it did not feel like the end of the world. There were no ashes to sweep, no broken gates to rebuild, no children huddled beneath collapsed walls. The markets reopened the next morning as they always had. The scribes unwrapped their styluses, cleared the dust from their tablets, and resumed recording the weight of barley, the names of shipments, the terms of contracts. Oxen still pulled carts through the wide processional roads. Vendors still shouted beneath awnings made of reed and faded linen. The smell of fish, of warm bread, of temple incense lingered in the same corners it always had. The sun rose at the same angle, casting familiar shadows across the polished bricks of the ziggurat. And yet, despite this unbroken rhythm, everything had changed. Babylon had fallen, but the fall was almost imperceptible. It was not a collapse, but a redirection, a bending of narrative that was so seamless, so surgically soft, that many may not have felt it at all. But the gods had felt it, or rather, the stories of the gods had changed. In the weeks that followed Cyrus's entry, clay tablets were etched with new words, not of surrender, but of selection. The Cyrus cylinder, a small barrel-shaped inscription made in the cuneiform language of Akkadian, spoke not of a Persian invader, but of a divinely appointed restorer. Slowly, softly, it declared that Marduk, the high god of Babylon, the god who had once chosen Hammurabi, who had held the city in favor for generations, had now turned away from Nabonidus, whose rituals had grown erratic, whose loyalties had wandered, whose festivals had been forgotten. According to the cylinder, Marduk looked over the earth, seeking a righteous king, and found Cyrus, not a conqueror, but a liberator, not a foreigner, but a chosen vessel. In the cool, even tone of official record-keeping, the cylinder reads, Marduk, the great lord, took heed of the complaints of the people. and sought out a just ruler. He pronounced the name of Cyrus, king of Anshan, and called him to march upon Babylon. There is no thunder here, no vengeance, no drama, only the gentle unfolding of inevitability. The text describes Cyrus not as a sword-bearer, but as a gardener restoring overgrown fields, a mason repairing cracked foundations. It speaks of him returning images of gods to their rightful sanctuaries, rebuilding altars, repairing shrines. To read it slowly is to hear a tone not of conquest, but of curated continuity, a carefully structured story designed to make even displacement feel like healing. But this was not purely magnanimous. It was calculated. Cyrus understood that Babylon did not respect chaos. It did not revere disruption. It revered order. If he could be framed not as a new force, but as a correction to a disrupted sequence, then Babylon would not resist. And so, even in the language of victory, Cyrus sounds careful, restrained, liturgical. There is no gloating, no boasts of armies, just a sense of return to divine favor, to temple ritual, to something that had always been meant to be. And Babylon listened. The priesthood, long estranged from Nabonidus, accepted the new alignment. They offered sacrifices not in defeat, but in welcome. Marduk had not been overthrown. He had simply spoken again. A new king stood at the head of the sacred calendar, and the calendar resumed. The Akitu festival, long disrupted, was performed once more with its chanted hymns, its symbolic renewal, its seasonal anchoring of heaven to earth. Life continued, but something lingered in the silence between rituals. A kind of collective exhale. Babylon had survived, but in surviving, it had admitted something fragile. But the gods were not fixed in loyalty. That divine favor could move across borders, that empire was not immune to entropy. And more deeply, it had admitted that its own greatness was no longer enough to hold the world in place. The fall had come not because the gates were weak or the army untrained, but because the rituals had lost their precision. The king had stopped listening. The priesthood had lost its grip. The people had stopped believing, or at least, started doubting. And so, Cyrus did not need to impose belief. He only needed to arrive as the answer to their quietest questions. And this is where the legacy of Babylon's fall becomes something stranger than defeat. In modern terms, we might say that church and state are separate, that religion and governance are distinct. But in Babylon, such a distinction would have been incomprehensible. The king was king because the gods allowed it. The calendar was sacred because it mirrored the cycles of the stars. The economy functioned because the temples recorded grain flows and omen texts and birth records. To disrupt the divine was to disrupt reality. So when the divine shifted, when Marduk was said to have called Cyrus, it was not just a religious change, it was a rewriting of the world. The old king became, retroactively, illegitimate. The rituals once withheld were suddenly valid again, and life, uninterrupted in practice, was fundamentally altered in meaning. For the scribes, this meant little in terms of daily function. They still rose at dawn, they still sharpened their stylus. The language of accounting did not change. Barley was still barley. Labor quotas still needed to be recorded. But the name at the top of the tablet was different, and that over time became the shape of memory. The children born after the conquest would grow up never knowing Nabonidus. They would memorize Cyrus's titles in school. They would recite the official version that the gods had grown silent. And then Cyrus had come, and the gods had spoken again, and they would not think this strange, because the streets were still busy, the bread still rose in ovens, the moon still waxed and waned, life had not stopped, and yet, history had turned. The dissonance here is quiet, but powerful. A city so obsessed with protocol, with repetition, with order had been taken not by fire, but by alignment. The conquest had worked because it echoed the city's own logic, and in that echo, a new future was written. One where the conqueror was welcomed, one where conquest felt like correction, one where silence became submission. The cylinder remains now housed in a museum, its cuneiform lines still sharp, still echoing that careful story. A story in which gods speak not with thunder but with redirection. A story in which the world turns quietly beneath the weight of names. And if you listen closely, if you read those lines with slow breath and quiet thought, you may not hear the shout of battle or the scream of siege. You may hear something else, the sound of a city changing without breaking, of a people nodding, adjusting, rewriting, of history folding in on itself like a priest folding robes after ritual. Babylon did not fall, it stepped aside, and Cyrus stepped in, and the world, as always, kept turning. The gardens, if they ever rose, did so not in the chronicles of Babylon's own scribes, but in the imaginations of those who arrived centuries later, after dust had settled where water once flowed. The legend of the Hanging Gardens does not come from tablets buried beneath Babylon's foundations, nor from inscriptions on palace walls, nor from any breath of clay record scratched by the careful hand of a Mesopotamian scribe. It comes, instead, from voices, faraway Greek voices, Roman pens, second-hand marvels preserved through time like the echo of a dream never quite fully remembered. It is from men like Diodorus Siculus, who wrote of green terraces stacked like steps toward the sky, built in tiers that allowed even the highest roots to feel the warmth of the sun, or Strabo, who repeated stories told by others describing a system of irrigation so advanced that water was drawn upward, against gravity itself, flowing not from sky to ground but from ground to canopy in a quiet defiance of nature's laws. Philo of Byzantium spoke of a machine, perhaps an early Archimedes' screw, that lifted water with such regularity that even the highest vines never thirsted, and yet none of these writers had seen the gardens. None walked among their supposed pillars. None stood in the cool, shaded arcades beneath hanging leaves. They were retellers of stories, receivers of impressions, and still, they described the gardens in tones so lush, so confident, that the image hardened into something that resembled memory. In their words, the Hanging Gardens became not only real, but inevitable. The descriptions repeat themselves across centuries. Broad terraces supported by stone arches, each level heavy with earth deep enough to grow fruit trees, date palms, and shrubs of lavender and myrrh. Vines crept over railings, curling around columns in slow, deliberate spirals. Narrow stone walkways meandered through thickets of green, offering travelers cool refuge from the heat. Birds darted among blossoms. The scent of damp soil and crushed leaves clung to the air. Fountains whispered in corners where sunlight could not reach. And above it all, the sound of water, the slow, rhythmic breath of water rising, flowing, falling on engineered stream that nourished not just the roots, but the illusion of paradise. The repetition of these elements, green over stone, stone over water, water over heat, forms a kind of lullaby through the sources, as if the gardens were not a place, but a thought, recurring and unprovable, and therefore all the more potent. These descriptions linger because they comfort, because they promise coolness in heat, order in nature, care in architecture. And perhaps that is why the story of the Hanging Gardens endured, even as their stones left no trace. Because they answered a longing not for fact, but for contrast, for softness amid the hardness of empire. But then, the silence begins to whisper. Because Herodotus, the so-called father of history, who described Babylon in obsessive detail, the size of its walls, the layout of its streets, the shape of its ziggurat, the customs of its people, never mentions the gardens. Not once. His description, though rich, includes no trace of vines, no note of terraces, no machinery of water lifted into the sky. And this absence echoes, it hums softly behind the myth. If the gardens were as grand as Diodorus described, how could Herodotus, a man who walked the streets of Egypt and measured temples by foot, have missed them entirely? The silence is not loud. It does not disprove, but it does nudge. It invites us to pause, to wonder not just about the garden's presence, but about their origin in story. And in that pause, we begin to see how myths take root not in facts, but in framing. The Greeks, after all, saw Babylon not as a city of record, but as a city of wonder, a place ancient, even to them, half lost in distance and difference. To their minds, Babylon was already a kind of fable, its language strange, its gods complex, its customs mysterious. And so, when they imagined Babylon, they painted it not just with facts, but with feelings of awe, of heat, of excess, of mystery. The Hanging Gardens were a natural bloom of that imagining. A cool dream set against the sun-scorched brick, a whisper of softness in a place defined by might. They were not Babylon as it was, but Babylon as it ought to have been, impossibly rich, impossibly clever, impossibly green. And then came the story that sealed the myth in romance, the tale that King Nebuchadnezzar II, greatest of Babylon's kings, built the gardens not for glory or power, but for love. That he had married a woman from the mountainous lands of Media or Persia, a woman who missed the scent of pine and the shape of hills. And so, to comfort her, he had a mountain built. A green, living mountain, a garden that climbed instead of spread, a place where she might feel the familiar breath of her homeland despite the choking flatness of the Babylonian plain. This version of the myth softens everything. It places the might of empire at the service of tenderness. It casts the king not as a tyrant, but as a husband. It imagines a love so deep that it could shape stone, move water, and bend gravity to its will. It is easy to believe because it is easy to want. And so, this version lingered. It was copied, retold, embroidered. It fit well into the mold of later sensibilities, a ruler softened by devotion, a queen who brings mountains to the plain, a garden that survives not through roots, but through storytelling. But even this, too, is curiously absent from Babylonian record. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions survive in abundance. He boasts of temples rebuilt, palaces expanded, walls strengthened, gods honored. His words are meticulous, carved in baked clay, sealed and stored. Yet not once does he mention a garden, not even as a metaphor, not even in passing. If he built it, he did not say. If he carved it, the stone did not keep the echo. And so, we are left with a strange duality. On one side, the Greek and Roman sources, rich in description, firm in belief, painting a vision of shaded grandeur. On the other, the silence of Babylon itself, silence that is not just absence, but almost defiant in its stillness. And perhaps that is what makes the story so enduring, not because it is true in the way stone is true, but because it floats just beyond proof. It offers the comfort of belief without the burden of certainty, and in that space, it survives. Like a vine without root, curling in the air, like water that flows in memory, not in channels. Like a garden that grows in the mind, long after the stones are gone. If the hanging gardens of Babylon ever truly stood, they rose above the hot plains of Mesopotamia, layered in green upon green with water lifted from earth, to canopy in a feat of hydraulic artifice. Then somewhere one would expect to find them, named, ascribed, measured, or praised in the records of the people who built them. And yet, in the vast, methodical, obsessively documented corpus of Babylonian writing, there is not a single clear, unambiguous mention, no clay tablet etched by the careful hand of a palace scribe, no temple receipt noting the movement of rare plants, no record of the complex water-lifting devices that would have been necessary to sustain vegetation in a land defined by drought and sun, no hymn, no inventory, no brick stamped with a royal seal proclaiming the garden's presence to the gods. And this is strange, because the Babylonians recorded everything in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script pressed into damp clay with styluses cut from reed. They catalogued the movement of grain, the rations given to workers, the temple inventories of oil and incense, the births of children, the dreams of priests, the omens seen in the livers of sacrificed animals. They recorded trade transactions and marriage contracts, and the precise positions of the stars at dawn. They recorded rainfall, eclipses, and how many bricks were fired for a wall. Their scribes were trained not in creativity but in precision. They copied and recopied royal decrees. They wrote in formula, in tradition, in rhythm. A palace built by Nebuchadnezzar might be recorded in 30 different ways, across dozens of tablets, each housed in a clay envelope, sealed with the mark of an official, then stored on shelves sorted by content and time. And many of those records have survived, despite invasions, fires, and centuries of burial. Archaeologists have unearthed thousands upon thousands of tablets from Babylonian libraries and archives. Some were hardened by fire, others by time, but their words remain. You can still hold them in your hand, still trace the indentation of a name, still read how many sheep were sacrificed on a certain day, to a certain god, by a certain priest. The ziggurat of Babylon, called Etemenanki, house of the foundation of heaven and earth, is recorded in detail. We know its height, its layered construction, its theological significance. The Ishtar Gate, too, is well attested. Descriptions of its glazed blue bricks, its lions and bulls and dragons, appear alongside logistical accounts how the bricks were fired, what materials were needed, who was paid, and when. Temples, warehouses, drainage canals, roadways, and palace extensions all appear in the textual record. There is no illusion of spontaneity in Babylonian architecture. It was not built on whim, but on schedule, planned, financed, and notarized. And yet, the gardens are missing, not faintly mentioned, not vaguely alluded to, not half described in damaged fragments, but simply absent. One might expect at least a fragment-one tablet among the thousands, crumbling perhaps, but still bearing the shape of a name, a measurement, a tribute. One might expect a line from Nebuchadnezzar boasting of a gift to his wife, or to the gods, or to the people. For Nebuchadnezzar II, the king most often credited with the garden's construction, was not a quiet monarch. He left inscriptions throughout his empire, praising his building works, justifying his rule, tying himself to divine favor. He writes in great detail about his palace, his temples, his walls. And yet, In all of it not even a whisper of a terraced garden. It is as though it never existed, and yet, it might have, because absence is not proof of non-existence. The gardens may have stood and yet not been recorded in the way we expect. Perhaps they were built by someone else before Nebuchadnezzar or after. Perhaps they were not seen as sacred or permanent. Perhaps they were private, hidden, not meant for record. Or perhaps they were described in records now lost to fire, to water, to time. Erosion is not only physical, it can be archival. A single flood could dissolve an entire chamber of history. A fire in a palace might consume both cedar beams and the soft tablets shelved between them. War does not always shatter with noise, it also silences, in layers. What remains of Babylon today is fragmented, its monuments broken, its archives partial. Many tablets lie unread in museums. Many more remain buried. And even those unearthed are damaged, edges cracked, lines missing, context gone. So it is possible the gardens are described somewhere half a sentence beneath a farmer's tax receipt. A line on a letter, too faded to translate. But the silence remains deafening. For a wonder of the ancient world, praised by later civilizations, drawn in detail by travelers who never saw it, the hanging gardens remain invisible to the people who should have known them best. And this raises a different kind of question. Not did they exist, but why would something so grand be left unmentioned? Was it perhaps a project never completed, a vision started, then abandoned? Or did it exist, but in such a way that it didn't qualify for the same kind of textual honor given to temples and walls? Was it seen not as monumental, but as decorative? Or were the gardens simply not Babylonian at all, perhaps attributed to Babylon by outsiders who misunderstood geography, or merged multiple cities into one mythic composite? We do not know. But we can imagine the scribes, seated cross-legged on woven mats, stylus in hand, clay tablet before them, copying records with rhythmic precision. They pause only to sharpen the stylus, to sip water, to glance at the sun's angle and calculate time. They write not to invent, but to preserve, and they preserve everything except the one thing we wish to find. This too is a kind of story, a story of omission, a garden that may have bloomed outside the margins of memory, or within it, a garden recorded not in cuneiform, but in longing. The longer we look, the quieter the record becomes. And in that quiet, sleep finds us. There is another city, far to the north of Babylon, where stone once rose against the skyline and water, not religion, shaped the soul of empire. That city was Nineveh, capital of Assyria, and it may be here beneath its once formidable walls, between the curves of its hills, under the traces of a vanished river, that the truth of the hanging gardens begins to root itself. While Babylon is remembered as the ceremonial heart of Mesopotamian grandeur, Nineveh was something else entirely industrial, deliberate, engineered with startling precision by a king whose name echoes not for piety or poetry, but for his mastery of hydraulics, of control, and of infrastructure. Sennacherib, king of Assyria in the early 7th century BCE, ruled not with temples but with levers, not with ziggurats but with aqueducts, and it is in his reign that we find, unlike Babylon, actual inscriptions that speak plainly and proudly of gardens, terraces, and water lifted through innovation. His own words, carved into stone and preserved across centuries of dust and collapse, describe not a myth, but a plan. I raised high gardens, he writes, resembling the Amarnas mountains. I caused a palace to be built, watered by the means of canals. I had trees planted therein. The words are not Greek. They are not hearsay. They are Sennacherib's, unetched with royal clarity. These were not metaphorical gardens, nor abstract wonders. They were engineered environments, structured like mountains, designed to astonish. And, crucially, they were built on terraces, something Babylon's flat terrain could never naturally accommodate. Nineveh, unlike Babylon, was not a city on a riverbed plain. It had hills, natural elevation, and cliffs that could be shaped into rising platforms. It had topography that lent itself to vertical design. And Sennacherib, ever practical, made use of it. To feed these gardens, he constructed a network of canals and aqueducts stretching across dozens of miles, some of them still visible in the scarred face of the northern Iraqi landscape. One of the most impressive was a limestone aqueduct at Jeroen, fitted with inscriptions attributing the feat to his will. Water was channeled, elevated, pressured, and delivered not merely to drink, but to astonish. And it did more than astonish, it soothed. In the heat of the Assyrian summer, water ran beside stone walkways, under shaded canopies, across pools fed by carefully positioned sluices. Palm trees swayed above columns. Imported cedars, cypresses, and fruiting trees from across the empire's reach were planted in symmetrical rows. Everything about the garden was curated, not wild, but organized, not accidental, but authored. This was not nature, it was the appearance of nature, engineered by empire. Sennacherib even mentions in one text a screw mechanism, possibly a proto-version of what would later be called the Archimedean screw that lifted water from lower channels to higher terraces. It is the only ancient Mesopotamian reference to such a device, and it fits perfectly with the Greek accounts of the hanging gardens. Water drawn upwards, step-like terraces, exotic flora, but here in Nineveh the device is described by the king himself, not imagined by distant travelers centuries later. In Babylon there is silence, in Nineveh there is specificity. Still, the world remembers Babylon. Why? Why did the legend migrate? Perhaps it is a matter of narrative gravity. Babylon, even to outsiders, symbolized majesty, mystery, and age. The Greeks, encountering Mesopotamian memory through intermediaries, may have conjoined stories from multiple cities into one mythic Babylona, kind of composite marvel where all wonders were said to reside. A cultural shorthand, perhaps what the Greeks heard of the gardens traveling orally across years, languages, and lands were fragments of truth from Nineveh reshaped to fit the more famous name, or perhaps they confused the two cities outright. Babylon and Nineveh, while politically distinct, shared architectural idioms, cultural assumptions, and environmental challenges. To a foreign merchant or soldier, one mud-brick city under a hot sun may have seemed much like another, and memory, especially second-hand, tends to compress and simplify, and so, slowly, the real gardens of Nineveh may have slipped into the imagined gardens of Babylon. The myths grew roots not in stone, but in the mind. But there is something else to consider. The tone. Babylon's grandeur, at least in our surviving records, is religious and ceremonial. Temples dominate. Ziggurats pierce the sky to reach the heavens. Rituals echo through the city calendar. Its architecture is sacred geometry, designed to please gods, not necessarily men. In contrast, Nineveh's surviving texts and ruins speak of empire as machine, aqueducts, gates, granaries, archives. Its wonder is not holy, but systemic. Sennacherib's pride was not in appeasing the gods through gold, but in bending nature to his will. He diverted rivers, leveled hills, and erected gardens where none should have grown. If the Greeks sought a tale of marvel rooted in scale and spectacle, Babylon offered them myth. But if they had read the tablets, had understood the tone of Assyria, they might have found their marvel not in the soft chants of temple priests, but in the quiet whir of a war. The hanging gardens, as remembered by the Greeks, resemble Nineveh's gardens in nearly every respect except location. Perhaps that was the only fiction, and even that fiction may have had a function. Babylon was a symbol. It stood for the East, for otherness, for wealth and artifice and time. And so, like many symbols, it absorbed the wonders around it, whether or not they had ever touched its soil. The garden may never have hung from Babylon's walls, but it now hangs in Babylon's name. That, too, is a kind of conquest, a narrative conquest, one that replaced real stone with remembered stone. And if that story still grows, still climbs in the mind, it is because stories like vines do not always stay rooted in place. They drift, they cling, and sometimes they find better soil in the imagination than in history. And so we come, not to a conclusion, but to a quiet resting place where questions no longer need answers, and the need to know gives way to the comfort of simply remembering. Whether the hanging gardens ever truly stood, whether they rose from Babylon's bricks, or bloomed beside the hills of Nineveh, or whether they lived only in the language of travelers, repeating what they thought they'd heard, is, in the end, a question that history cannot resolve. And perhaps that is precisely the point. For there are some stories that do not belong to stone, some wonders that are not held in mortar or chiseled into walls, some truths that are not revealed through evidence, but whispered through time, carried like pollen from one telling to the next, drifting gently into myth. The hanging gardens have become such a story not because of their height or engineering, not because of their exact location or construction materials, but because they endure in the space between certainty and silence. In that space, memory does its quiet work. And imagination, like ivy, fills in the cracks where history recedes. When the dust of centuries covers all else, what remains is not the blueprint, but the vision. Not the irrigation channel, but the sound of imagined water trickling over stone. Not the brick count, but the curve of a vine. And that vision, however unproven, is strangely resilient. Myths, after all, are not lies. They are truths distilled not in detail, but in meaning. They form when facts fade, but longing endures. And the hanging gardens, whether real or not, symbolize something deeply human, the impulse to bring beauty into the barren, to cultivate softness in a hard world, to shape joy where nature resists, to imagine a place not just for power, but for peace, a place lush with shade, scent, and stillness, a place where someone once walked not to command, but to breathe. In that sense, the gardens do not need stone foundations to be real. They rise instead from memory, from metaphor, from meaning. They represent effort, human effort in a land where the sun crushed everything soft, where dust coated skin and shade was fleeting. They represent the triumph of care over climate, of architecture over drought, of design over desolation. Whether raised by Nebuchadnezzar for a homesick queen, or engineered by Sennacherib to tame the Tigris, or imagined by Greek minds yearning for Eastern marvels, they are all, in the end, expressions of desire, desire for beauty, desire for balance, desire for a garden, a green place, in the middle of empire. And that desire echoes, it echoes even now. When we close our eyes and imagine Babylon, we don't think of receipts or city gates or long clay tablets of grain distribution. We think of terraces, of glistening leaves, of hanging vines casting filtered light across columns, of water where there should be none. We dream of the garden because it offers something the archive does not repose. And perhaps that is why the gardens were never recorded, not because they were never built, but because they were never finished, or never public, or never official, or never even intended to last. Perhaps they were a fleeting experiment in luxury, or a whisper of joy hidden behind palace walls, or a metaphor given shape for a season. Perhaps they were not meant to be seen, but to be remembered, or not even remembered, but dreamed. There is a kind of silence in that, but not an empty one, a fruitful silence. The kind that holds more than it withholds. The kind of silence that ruins speak in, because ruins do not tell stories. They wait for us to tell them. Their stones do not insist. They allow. And in that allowance, we create meaning. We project. We imagine. And in doing so, we make the past live again, not as it was, but as we need it to be. The hanging gardens may never have existed in the world, but they exist in history, in the Seven Wonders, in the stories passed from Herodotus to Strabo to Secundus, in the pages of modern books, in the corners of museum placards, and the gentle curve of ancient inscriptions reinterpreted by modern minds. They exist because we believe them too, not with proof, but with persistence, not with evidence, but with empathy. And that too is history, not just what happened, but what was hoped, not just what endured, but what was longed for. We live now in a world of records, digitized, time-stamped, searchable. We are surrounded by data and trained to mistrust anything not cited, not proven, not photographed or preserved. And yet some part of us, deep and soft and human, still responds to the unproven, still bends toward the unverified, still believes in the possibility of a place where vines grew in order, and water defied gravity, and kings built for love, or peace, or simply because they could. The gardens do not need GPS coordinates to matter. They are a symbol of something deeper yearning. And so we end not with a discovery, but with a reflection. That perhaps the most enduring wonders are the ones never fully verified, because they remain open, because they invite us in, because they let us sleep in their shade, even if only in our minds. The hanging gardens, if they stood, were magnificent, but even if they did not, they are no less real. They live in the dream of the past, and as you drift now into your own quiet night, perhaps you can walk there in silence, in imagination, in the cool beneath the leaves. And there, under layered green, far from noise, far from certainty, far from the need to know, you can rest. To step into the sacred heart of Babylon was to step into a silence not born of emptiness, but of weight, ritual weight, symbolic stillness, the thick hush of centuries wrapped in ceremony. Long before you reached the throne or the altars, long before the moment of offering or speech, there was the passage, the slow procession that led inward from the roaring avenues, from the chatter of markets and heat of sunlit courtyards toward the interior where light softened and time stretched. It began at the Ishtar Gatan entrance, not of bare stone, but of mythic blue, its glazed tiles, shimmering with the deep hue of crushed lapis, a color that caught the morning sun and returned it in cool, deliberate tones. Lions marched across its walls, dozens, maybe hundreds, rendered in profile with golden manes and silent roars, symbols not of violence but of protection. The gate did not swing open like a common door. It stood, waiting, passive, while permitted feet crossed beneath its arch. This was no passage for the hurried. It demanded slowness. Just beyond it, a wide processional way stretched inward, its paving stones worn smooth by centuries of ritual steps. Here the priest-kings would walk flanked by officials. Scribes and the occasional foreign emissary granted the rare honor of entry moving in practiced rhythm. Each step calibrated, robes falling in regulated folds, sandals brushing the stone with a sound not unlike the whisper of wind across paper. Along the edges of this path stood walls inscribed with fragments of devotion, praises to Marduk, declarations of conquest, prayers for harvests. You might not understand the script, but you would feel it, the sense of permanence, of meaning layered into material. And slowly, as you moved deeper, the air began to shift. The dry heat of the outside world gave way to something cooler, denser. A mix of scents emerged: resin, cedar wood, sweet smoke curling from unseen braziers, not pungent, but constant, not overwhelming, but inescapable. This was the smell of sacredness, of time that belonged to gods, not men. Inside the temple precinct, color dulled, but texture bloomed. Walls were not left bare. They bore relief scenes of offerings, divine animals, stars arranged in celestial order. The floor, laid with tile, sometimes glazed, sometimes stone, responded to footfalls with a soft echo, each step a reminder of space, scale, and surveillance. There were eyes everywhere, not human eyes, but divine, symbolic, painted or carved onto walls, statues, even doors. They did not blink, they did not sleep, and they reinforced the truth. This was not your world. It belonged to beings beyond you. Rooms branched out from the main path, chambers whose purposes were known only to the initiated. One might hold sacred oils, another censers and bells, another the tablets containing astrological forecasts. Each room was kept sealed, locked, monitored. Each had its own attendant priests, men who had trained for decades to carry a single object correctly, to recite a single phrase without flaw. Even dust was swept with reverence. Even silence was measured. Farther in, you would find the throne rooms, not the public halls of audience, but the inner sanctuaries reserved for celestial alignment. These rooms were opened only when the stars permitted, when lunar readings gave their blessing. On ordinary days they remained shuttered, wrapped in darkness, their furniture covered with cloth, their air untouched. But when opened, they revealed their riches: thrones plated in gold, shaped with curling motifs of beasts and gods, benches inlaid with ivory, stone reliefs that shimmered slightly in torchlight. The light here was never direct. It filtered in through slits, bounced from polished surfaces, flickered from flame. There were no open windows. The world outside ceased to exist. Only ritual remained. In such rooms, the priest-king might sit, draped in white linen layered with heavy thread, perhaps gold, perhaps dyed wool imported from the West, stiff and ceremonial. His head would be wrapped, not just against the sun, but in accordance with ritual law. Every fold had meaning. Every pin was placed by hand, in silence, by an attendant trained for that precise act. Around him, other figures moved not as people, but as roles. The scribe, whose job it was to record the day's offerings, the astrologer whose tablets bore calculations from the previous night, the cupbearer who poured water blessed 3 times before being drawn from the cistern, and always, incense, burning slowly, curling upward, a visible reminder of breath, spirit, transformation. This was not the smoke of cooking fires. This was the language of the gods, carried on cedar and resin, tickling the back of your throat without offense. The priest-king did not speak freely here. He chanted, he read, he listened. Words were not tools of expression, but formulas of control. To speak incorrectly was to risk cosmic imbalance, and so every phrase was rehearsed, every inflection marked on wax tablets, practiced by night, refined by day. Those who heard him speak did not respond. They received, they observed. Their roles were not reactive, but receptive. In adjacent quarters, the priestly class prepared themselves. Their chambers were simple but orderly: reeds for sleeping, bowls of oil for anointing, tablets for memorization. A scribe might spend hours copying a hymn already written thousands of times before, not to invent, but to preserve. The act of writing was devotion. Even their mistakes were managed with ritual. Broken tablets were not discarded, but buried with care in designated pits, as if returning them to the gods. The corridors between rooms were narrow, intentionally so, guiding bodies along fixed routes, restricting the mind from wandering. Here, movement was not free, it was dictated. As above, so below. Even staircases followed sacred ratios, their steps aligned with theological principles. There was no architectural spontaneity in this world. Every brick laid under the gaze of the gods, every pillar standing as prayer, and though gold gleamed, it did not shine with wealth, it shimmered with duty. A temple door might be fitted with bronze studs, but not to impress mortals. It was to echo thunder, to mimic the heavens. Every symbol was layered, every design recursive. And so the deeper you moved into this world, the more time began to dissolve. Outside, a market might erupt in noise, a child might cry, a soldier might shout, but in here there was only rhythm, the chant of priests, the dripping of oil, the flicker of fire, a crown resting silently on a low altar, a breath drawn before recitation, and the weight not just of the crown, or the robes, or the obligations, but the weight of continuity, of being one in a long chain, of maintaining a pattern older than stone. Here, the priest-king did not rule as a man. He functioned as a conduit. The divine will moved through him, not because he was powerful, but because he was still receptive, obedient to the laws written in stars. And as he sat on that throne silent, wrapped in layers, eyes fixed on the horizon of meaning, he was not above his people, but beneath his gods, held in place not by fear, but by ritual, not by might, but by harmony, not by force, but by stillness. And it is in that stillness that we now linger. Every day, without deviation, the rhythm of sacred time rose before the sun, woven not of light and shadow but of ritual breath, incense, smoke, and calendar markings older than memory. Before the first shaft of daylight broke over the rooftops of Babylon, the priest-king was already stirring, though not with haste. Never with haste. Never with haste, for in his world there was no rushing, only readiness. Every day, at the same hour, before the city's commoners lit their fires or traders began to shout, he underwent the first of many acts of sacred preparation, the morning ablution, a ritual bathing not for comfort but for cosmic cleanliness. The water was drawn at night, sealed in vessels of carved stone or bronze, guarded by temple attendants who ensured it had not been touched by impurity or shadow. It was cool by dawn, settled, and silent. The priest-king would stand bare from the waist up, the linen garments of sleep folded carefully behind him, and let the water run over his skin, as prayers were whispered behind him, prayers not for health or fortune, but for alignment, for purity of intention, for the correct posture of body and mind before the day's unseen energies unfolded. Oils would follow, oils of cedar, of myrrh, of resins mixed and stored in vessels labeled not with names but with omens. A priest would anoint the king's shoulders, palms, and temples. Each gesture mattered, each drop was measured. Every day, without deviation, this rite began the unfolding of a day not of politics, but of choreography. The garments worn were not chosen for beauty or power, but for meaning. Certain colors aligned with certain deities, certain moon phases, certain planetary houses. The hem must fall at a precise length. The sash must be tied with 3 loops. To err even slightly was to invite confusion between realms. The king would not speak until a priest had read the dawn omen, usually from the liver of a sheep sacrificed at first light. The liver, carefully removed and examined, bore messages, a bulge here, a wrinkle there. These were not anatomy, but revelation. A group of augurs would confer, murmur, nod, and only when consensus emerged would the priest-king be addressed. It is favorable. Only then would he eat, and even then, only prescribed foods, usually barley bread, a pomegranate, perhaps a date. No spices unless permitted by calendar. No meat unless the stars allowed it. No speech, still, beyond ritual phrase. Every day, at the same hour, these acts were repeated. Not because the king was bound by fear, but because the cosmos demanded rhythm. The gods lived in order, and to reflect that order was to honor them. After morning rites, the temple officials would present the day's readings, astronomical tablets inscribed in the late hours of the night by watchers on rooftops who charted the paths of Venus, Jupiter, and the ever-wandering moon. These were not observations, they were frameworks of decision. If the moon entered a house ruled by misfortune, travel would be delayed. If Mars rose too early, letters would remain unsent. If Mercury appeared flickering, the day's proclamations would be spoken twice, with different phrasing, to avoid misunderstanding between the realms. Every day, before the stars aligned, the king's path was adjusted not by his will, but by divine architecture. In the mid-morning, sacrifices began not of cruelty, but of calibration. Animals chosen the day before would be cleansed, garlanded, and brought into the inner court by silent handlers. A white bull, perhaps, or a dove, or a ram, each chosen for its alignment with a specific god, or a planetary concern, or a question facing the temple bureaucracy. The slaughter was not public spectacle. It was controlled, clean, witnessed by senior priests who recorded each motion. The entrails were inspected. The smell of burning fat sweet, heavy wafted through the temple corridors, not to announce power, but to offer scent to the gods, who were said to breathe through smoke. Offerings would be arranged on polished stone, bowls of grain, honey cakes, water from sacred rivers, wine aged in sealed jars. Each item faced a certain direction, poured in a certain arc, arranged in symmetry. The priest-king might place a hand upon the stone, might murmur a formula, but he did not dictate the ritual. He was guided through it, anointed by it, shaped by its flow. By midday, the temple would hum not with activity, but with fulfillment. Rituals complete, omens read, sacrifices accepted. The king might meet with scribes, might review reports from provinces or letters from governors, but even these interactions began and ended with formulas. Phrases bound to protocol. No letter was opened without incense, no seal was broken without a nod from the astrologer. Every decision tethered to something deeper, and as the heat of day gave way to long afternoon shadows, the next phase began, preparation for night. For in Babylon, night was not rest, it was revelation. The stars ruled the dark, and through them, the gods spoke. Every evening, without deviation, teams of priestly astronomers climbed to temple rooftops and began their vigil. The king would not join them, but he would await their findings. The sky, for the Babylonians, was a scroll, each star a word, each planet a sentence. Venus rising just before dawn might indicate divine favor. Saturn appearing near a red star might suggest drought. The watchers did not gaze idly. They recorded, they compared, they consulted ancient tables, and in the quiet of night, under oil lamps and thick air, they wrote. They scratched cuneiform signs into wet clay with styluses as thin as reeds, as precise as thought. They read the skies not once, but 3 times first, for signs, then for patterns, then for permission. Only after the 3rd reading would a priest descend, enter the king's quarters, and whisper the findings. The moon is clear, the signs are stable, you may proceed, or there is discord in the east. Wait until the 3rd hour. Even the king's dreams, if recalled, would be interpreted. A dream of fire, of a broken bowl, of rain falling in silence. These were not personal, they were political, celestial. Every dream was filed, every omen mapped, every deviation addressed. There was no end to the ritual, only movement between forms of it. And so the priest-king's life unfolded, not in bursts of power, not in decrees shouted from balconies, but in this quiet alignment, this daily tracing of divine will across flesh, word, and sky. This devotion not to grandeur, but to correctness. To be king in Babylon was not to rule, but to conform, to adjust, to calibrate, and to trust that through discipline, the heavens would remain balanced, and the gods would remain at peace. Every day, without deviation, the cycle renewed. Every day, at the same hour, the flame was lit. Every day, before the stars aligned, the prayer was spoken, and in that repetition, the world endured. It was in the days of early spring, when the twin rivers swelled with snowmelt and the scent of new blossoms mingled with the last breath of winter dust, that Babylon entered its sacred new year, not with fireworks, nor with feasting alone, but with a ceremony that moved like the slow turning of the heavens, measured, inevitable, and woven with the same threads that bound sky to earth, God to man. This was the Akitu festival, the ritual renewal of cosmic order, when the king himself became the vessel through which the world was made right again. And so it began not with trumpets or noise, but with preparation so quiet, so precise, that the city seemed to hold its breath. Crowds gathered outside the temple precinct days in advance, not shouting, but murmuring prayers, touching amulets, placing reeds and flowers in crevices of walls. The priests read omens in liver and star. The barley was harvested and offered. The statues of gods, so long fixed in their sanctuaries, were carefully washed, clothed, and carried through the streets hidden from common sight beneath cloth-draped platforms, yet known to be there. The air thick with incense and the rising warmth of the sun carried with it not just smoke but a kind of acceptation, a sense that what was about to happen had always happened, must always happen, and would happen now as it had before. In the palace, behind shuttered chambers, the priest-king prepared, not as ruler, not as conqueror, but as supplicant, for on this day, the power he carried all year was to be taken from him, piece by piece, word by word, until nothing remained but the trembling human core. The sacred garment's robe of white linen, sash of dyed wool, sandals with gold studs were laid aside. The rings came off his fingers, the crown was removed, and with each item, the ritual chorus whispered invocations, unweaving the cosmic identity he had worn. Step by step, the crown was removed. Piece by piece, the king became a man again. He was led by priests not alone, but not with pomp, either through inner corridors to the temple of Marduk, the heart of Babylon's faith, where the god's statue waited not to be praised, but to judge. There, in the dim sanctuary thick with centuries of burnt offerings, beneath stone ceilings, where carved stars loomed like frozen witnesses, the king stood. And then the high priest approached. There was no greeting, no bow, no blessing, only a ritual rebuke recited in the ancient tongue, older even than the empire, questioning the king's loyalty, naming his failures, reminding him that he was not the source of law but its executor, not the origin of power but its channel. The king did not respond. He was not allowed. And then, as required, the priest struck him, not in anger, not to harm, but with intention, a ceremonial slap across the face, firm, public, symbolic. If the king's eyes welled with tears, the gods were pleased. If his expression remained dry, the ritual faltered. And so, in that moment, all eyes turned not to gold or empire or declarations of victory, but to tears, quiet tears, resting in the lower lid, trembling as they fell, the salt of submission, the water of renewal. The king's emotion was not weakness, it was proof. Proof that he still knew his place. Proof that the gods still moved through him. Proof that power meant humility, not hubris. Outside, the crowds waited. They did not see the slap. They did not hear the rebuke. But they waited for the sign when the king would re-emerge. Garments restored, crown returned, now re-sanctioned by Marduk to rule for another cycle. Until then, the city did not move. Markets paused. Music stopped. Even the river seemed to still its murmur. The world itself hung on ritual. And when at last the moment came, the priest-king emerged not triumphant, but transformed. The same man, yet made new. The same crown, now earned again. The crowds bowed low, not cheering, but acknowledging. And the festival continued with offerings, processions, and quiet joy. But none forgot the slap, none forgot the tears, and none, perhaps, more than the king himself, who knew better than anyone that the line between ruler and ruin was as thin as ritual thread. But his power was not held, but borrowed. That the gods watched always, not with wrath, but with expectation. And that every spring, without deviation, he would walk again into the sanctuary, stand again beneath the carved stars, and offer again his tears in exchange for cosmic balance. It was not theater, it was structure, not performance, but preservation. Not for show, but for the survival of the world. Perhaps today the stars were clear, perhaps today no cloud passed inauspiciously, perhaps the moon waxed without interference, and the omens read smooth as oil poured over polished stone. Or perhaps not. For in Babylon, governance was not a matter of will, nor conquest, nor ambition, it was alignment. Rulership itself, from palace to priesthood, moved only when the heavens permitted, and the gods, it was said, spoke not in voices, but in signs subtle, precise, unrelenting signs. They appeared in the curling of smoke, in the glint of a raven's wing, in the pause of thunder without rain. But most of all, they appeared in the sky above and the organs of beasts below. Night after night, without fail, the watchers climbed to the tops of ziggurats, carrying tablets, styluses, and the weight of the cosmos on their shoulders. They waited for Venus, for Mars, for the tremble of eclipses, the shifting brightness of stars, the slow blink of planets in retrograde. They did not guess, they did not hope, they measured, they compared, they traced the same constellations their grandfathers had traced and their grandfathers before them, linking each celestial rhythm to records etched in clay stored in cool chambers, each one a repository of what had been, what could be, what must be avoided. A single star out of place could delay a marriage. A moon rising blood red could cancel a trade expedition. The absence of Jupiter from its expected station could unravel a treaty. And in tandem with the sky, they turned to the earth, to animals, to the interiors that held secret shapes. The liver of a sacrificial sheep was not merely flesh, but a mirror of the divine order. Its lobes and curves, its surface blemishes, its symmetry or lack thereof, each element corresponded to outcomes, not guesses, not symbols, outcomes. Entire decisions whether to build a canal, to fortify a city wall, to send messengers to distant governors hung on the twist of a vein, the firmness of a texture. Priests trained for decades to interpret these patterns. They memorized entire libraries of precedent. If a gall bladder was swollen, and the right lobe thin, and the surface unbroken, and it coincided with a northerly breeze and the sudden flight of birds, then one must wait, or proceed, but only after offering copper to EA or send a decoy envoy first, or call for 7 days of fasting. The permutations were endless, the responsibility, total. Even the king, even the high priest, even the God's anointed vessel upon the earth, deferred to the signs. There were days when a decree was written, sealed, but not announced because a cloud drifted from east to west in the wrong season. There were nights when the city lay waiting for an edict that never came because Mars lingered in a quadrant of ill fortune, and so the state waited. People waited. The king waited. Not because he feared the people, but because he feared imbalance. One wrong step might not anger the masses, it might unhinge the entire order of heaven and earth. The divine wrath was not theatrical. It did not roar. It withdrew. Crops withered. Floods came early. Dreams turned sour. A priest misread a sign, and 3 years later a plague might come. The connection could never be proven, but it was known. Known in the marrow, known in the dust. So they were careful. So they moved slowly. So they read the sky with the same reverence they offered to gods carved in stone, not as background, but as scripture, not as decoration, but as directive. Perhaps today the stars were clear, perhaps today the sky was silent, but perhaps not. Perhaps there was a flicker, a pause, a bird flying low, and that would be enough to stop a city, to quiet a ruler, to rewrite what was believed to be certain. Power here was not the ability to act, it was the wisdom to wait, the courage to defer, the patience to align, and above all, the humility to know that the gods did not need to speak aloud to be heard. Once seated upon a throne, now resting in clay, that is the arc not only of kings, but of all who ever held the illusion of permanence. The priest-king of Babylon, wrapped in robes that shimmered like morning heat, anointed in oils drawn from the edge of empire, bowed to by thousands and feared by governors, did not walk freely through his city. He did not wander the markets. He did not laugh at dinner or confide in a friend. His words were weighed before spoken, shaped by ritual even in private. Every syllable he uttered could be recorded, misinterpreted, echoed into law, and so he spoke less, and so he listened more. And when he did listen, it was not to honesty, but to careful deference. No one spoke plainly to a man believed to carry divine authority, not his scribes, not his generals, not even the high priests who crowned him. They spoke in layers, in deference, in bows that concealed fear, and he knew this. He knew that the crowd cheered for the office, not the man, that the rituals were older than his name, and would continue after his bones were sealed in a brick-lined tomb. There is a stillness in this kind of power, a suffocating stillness, born not of calm but of pressure. It is the stillness of never being uncertain in public, never hesitating in gesture, never faltering in prayer. The fear was not of rebellion, it was of imbalance, of divine silence, of signs gone unread or unreadable. In his chambers, after the processions and omens and sacrifices, the priest-king sat alone, not unattended, but alone in the truest sense, surrounded by servants, watched by guards, observed by priests, but not known. He could not weep in public. He could not speak of dreams unless they fit the omen books. He could not ask, "What if the gods do not hear me?" because such a question would fracture the entire structure that held Babylon upright. Every morning he rose at the same hour, every gesture was mapped, every robe was draped in the same folds. But in that repetition he felt the creeping breath of fragility, because he knew he must have known that all this could vanish. That one eclipse, one defeat, one dry harvest could erode divine favor. The gods did not write in ink, they wrote in wind and fire and time. Their messages could change, their eyes could turn away, and if they did, his gold would become lead, his throne a platform for the next stand. So he carried not just the crown, but the uncertainty that came with it, not just the seal, but the silence. The days were filled with ritual, but the nights were long. He may have lain beneath painted ceilings, lulled by distant chants, but inside, the pressure never ceased, because power, in Babylon, was not held, it was borrowed, and borrowed things must always be returned. He would have known this, the same way he knew the names of his forefathers, carved in stone but spoken less and less each generation. He knew that someday, someone would sit on his throne and speak his name only in ceremony, and someday after that, not at all. The records would crack, the bricks would fade, the reeds would grow where his walls once stood. The rituals, so tightly choreographed, would become memory, then story, then myth. And so the weight he bore was not only ritual, It was time, it was transience. He may have ruled Babylon, but Babylon belonged to the gods, and the gods belonged to no man. So he ruled in stillness, he ruled in fear, he ruled in obedience, and when he died, perhaps there was no fanfare. Perhaps his body was wrapped in linen, placed beneath stone, sealed with bitumen, marked with a name already beginning to erode. Perhaps, and now, as we speak of him not by name, but by role, we remember what he carried, not the sword, not the scepter, but the weight of meaning, the weight of being believed, the weight of knowing that all glory fades, and all ceremony dissolves. Once seated upon a throne, now resting in clay,